Yeah, so your voice will like be picked up like not as strongly as mine because it's like a I've got this nice like condenser microphone that sort of just takes an environmental sound. So, but anyway, it should pick up you guys pretty well. What was that? Yeah, specifically because of the conversation that we had, that really helped me. Like just having to explain to like a human being in front of me really forces me to sort of, because of their input, see it, like from more angles and like work out how to ground what I'm saying, like in much more practical terms.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because I guess, SE inferior of the INTJ, something like that is probably my bane.
All right, I'm back.
Welcome back. I started recording, but please just be casual. I'm sure it's like if there are sections of irrelevancy, I'll just probably try and edit that out or something like that. So just I wanted us to try and just forget about it or something like that. Like forget about that it's being recorded. Would be the ideal, or at least for me, I'm probably the worst person at reacting to being surveilled.
Yeah, well, I'm sure if there's anything said that people don't agree with it they said, you could ask for it to be taken out, and it would be respected.
Yeah, no, I'll follow any direction that you have.
I doubt I will have to, but it's good to know in case, because you word difficult concepts, and then it's like, if you word it the wrong way or the way you don't intend it, it's easy to come across as a monster.
Well, I would say it's not necessary. I mean, it's weird because I think subconsciously you have the propensity of falling into the traps that have been so carefully laid out by people that are trying to be offended, and they have strangely distorted moral language so radically that and that some of the words that they use have almost become meaningless because it's like you're racist because of structural racism. So it's like, what does racism actually mean? I heard Douglas Murray say in an interview quite recently, if everyone is a misogynist, is it a bad thing to be a misogynist anymore? If we're, like it loses all of its purchase.
I don't think that's the purpose of that. I think it's just in America, like the left flexes that muscle all the time of attributing bad things to a symbol. Like just recently, they did it with the 13-starred flag is now racist and whatever. And it's when you do that to every part of a person's identity, then they become the bad person, no matter what. And it's so easy to do. But imagine if someone said afros are a symbol of black oppression of other people, or something like that. And, really flex the muscle the same way the left does with any symbolism that they want to. And just made it seem real that people really thought it was a symbol of oppression. And then, that worked. So the next step up, fried chicken, or whatever you wanted to do. And then, slowly tear away at it. And, you could say anything relating back to Africa relates back to some awful thing, and you could destroy their roots and destroy a group of people that way. And they love flexing that muscle because it never gets accounted for or called back or said, hey, wait a second, what if you were doing this to somebody else? Would that be right? Because it already established who the villain is in America.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of maintaining the fragile ideological ecosystem, which is that, like, they almost have to get away with that kind of imbalance because it is a symbol of the imbalance of the structural oppression, and that it's the corrective opposite, that needs to be applied. And so you get this idea that it's like tit for tat, it's retributive justice, in that sense, done on a collective scale, which is, it's kind of scary because that is the fascist ideology in a nutshell. It's also a war crime essentially. Collective punishment and collective guilt are really bad concepts, that we sort of evolved out of and we suppressed from our culture, because we see how monstrous they are in some sense. But that is the core notion of morality in, or I guess somewhat postmodernism, in that, like your collective lived experience that you get to inherit that is something that you just have to be saddled with, and you have to sort of, you have to channel it, you have to like really construct it as the core of your being in some sense, and it becomes basically the spiritual version of the genetic obsession that the Nazis had. You know, is just like, but sadly the only way to sustain the identity though is through the specialized suffering of your identity. So it's like it's even more of a brittle kind of fragile system, and so in some sense the only way to keep that notion alive as a vehicle for progress as well is to vilify and to keep the accusations coming and to keep fabricating the accusations and acting on those accusations in a public way or in a cultural way, so that eventually a political force will have the legitimacy to sort of represent that cultural hegemony and that vision of society, which is fundamentally fascistic. I'm just.
And, well, I'll add that every time they do it to a thing, and people pile onto it in some way, it makes sort of an intellectual buyer's remorse that acts as a stability or support for what they're trying to do. Because if you were down with tearing down some priceless piece of history that represented a culture that you didn't like at the moment, you can't change your mind later as easily. It's like buying a $5,000 MacBook or something. And then a month later, you're not going to say, no, Apple's stupid. You'll have all these reasons why MacBooks are great and Apple is just so innovative and wonderful and so on. But it's the same thing with an act of hatred that you're doing, that you want to spin it as a positive action. In your head, you did it for positive reasons initially because it blocked out the negative. And having that come to a moment where you realize, I just tore down a piece of culture of other people and I'm desecrating a society, it gets harder and harder the more you do it. So that's how it supports what they try to do, I think.
So I've been using this formulation that I've come up with recently about that the real problem that we're having is a problem of ethics, which is, this is a bit strange because I believe that the words ethics and morality in the MBTI system are opposites. They should actually pertain to the other function. But anyway, but that instead of principles anymore, we have principles that pertain to identities, and because essentially equality has become an adjective of an identity instead of an actual ethical principle, the principle belongs to the identity. It doesn't belong to a subjective thinking human being that has a non-racialist starting point. It's like you already have this collective vehicle, like that essentially we don't have a principle. We now have sort of. I think this is also why euthanasia is coming back into view. I don't know if you know this, but the Nazis were very big on euthanasia, even their own people. As a kind of. I guess that is slightly different because in Europe it's the right of the individual, if they're mentally ill even, to elect to have the state help them kill themselves. But I think that happens because you basically say that mentally ill people are the same as a physically disabled person, that these are just basically, they're different forms of identity, and you have the freedom to do what you want with, the equal integrity that each identity has. And so because there's this hypothetical separate but equal identity consciousness that is the end, and so the means to that end is that you just give people the right to kill themselves, for instance, never mind the complexity of the issues of perhaps mental illness or something like that, in terms of the actual ethical questions or the specific challenges that are based on moral principles. All that goes out the window, because the only moral principles that matter are the moral principles that belong and are possessed by the identity itself. And so I think that we've already moved into that paradigm, because we have enough people that are vocal in our society, essentially, that they represent this view that essentially they either so I was going to get into the guilt and innocence dichotomy again, but yeah, I mean, as soon as you're in that framework, you don't have room for ethical principles. You don't have a thinking mind anymore, because essentially principles are all about adjectives that apply to identities. So, like, you don't have a critical faculty anymore. In fact, most of life, most of the essence of life becomes absolutely invisible. You just become a sort of there are two phrases that come to mind here, which is like a kind of autism, a kind of insulated autism, and the kind of the self-indulgent narcissism that gets sort of, that always gets to get its way, because whatever ideal that it feels that it's not achieving that it wants, it can just sort of say, well, somebody else is guilty and I'm innocent. And because they can't be guilty, somebody else must be guilty. So it's like it's this complete binary. It's like either I'm innocent and they're guilty, and there's no way that I could be guilty. And so don't you dare try to say that I'm guilty for the weakness of my identity that I inherited from history or something like that. And so they've got this whole and so in that binary, they cannot navigate life as an individual anymore. They cannot navigate, they cannot find a way to make progress in the normal course of things, in terms of like using other tools other than guilt and innocence. It's like they just have these two buttons to push. And so those are the only two buttons that they can push. And they're forced in doing that because they believe in the identity, essentially, as the center of of morality, in some sense, the core of morality.
And even if they don't, at that point, society will push you to the point where you have to at least pretend. If you want to get anywhere in life, you have to get there through the buttons of your grouping. And by like the unit of your grouping will move you up to that point if you just believe in the unit and advocate for your unit of people, whatever it may be, to make them more powerful, to give you more. It's gross. It takes away individuality completely because you're not doing it for you anymore. Everything for you is provided by your identity.
It's ironic.
Yeah, that's scary. Like, I wouldn't want to fail because my group failed. I want to fail on my own terms, Pretty scary prospect.
Yeah, and then you get that very resentful, sort of argument, well, I would love to be able to fail on my individual grounds, but I don't even get the opportunity because history was so oppressive and the structural racism is just so strong. And so you get this kind of this self-referential, kind of prophecy, self-fulfilling prophecy that, and the more you feed it, the more it makes the narrative true, because like in terms of promoting people in view of their group identity, you have effectively destabilized everything functioning in society that actually functions organically or authentically on the level of on the level of individuality and individual competence, and like merit or anything like that gets completely sort of anyway, that's sort of the same idea, but
yeah, it's tricky too, I think, because every time anybody wants to do anything in terms of a political or social situation, they don't know what a half measure is. They always go so far that it goes to a terrible place. And I think you don't want an identity that you have to take away your individuality. But at the same time, there are times when it's useful to be part of a group of people too. So I think, in a way, that has to be addressed somehow. But I don't know what to say for that. I think there'll always be, like a night out with the boys. That's an identity, and it's healthy to have a night, just out with people that that are guys. If you're a guy, it would be healthy to be around girls 24/7. And the same thing's true for girls. I mean, it's nice for them to have a night out with the girls. It's an identity, but there's also parts of it that are, I guess, natural, and it's I don't know. I don't want to go into Nashville too much with that, but you have to set a line where it stops. You know.
But I don't think that, like, there are ways of conceiving of identity that isn't problematic for me at all. Like, I mean, an identity that has absolutely no moral weight to it. You know, in some sense, in some sense, you can have an identity that has to do with morality, but it's not so much as that you morally value the belonging to the identity so much as that the identity itself is a descriptor of principles that you hold and you just use it as a shorthand. But so it's like if you tell someone I'm a classical liberal, you're basically just using a shorthand to describe the principles that you believe in, and then maybe like if other people have a reference system that they know what philosophies fall under that title, then they can more specifically ask you to maybe like to engage in a negotiation or maybe like an exchange in some way that if you want to talk about that substance. But if you have an identity, I mean, like, you can have as many identities as you claim to have. That's almost actually at the core of the common law system, is that you can these things are free and open in a free in a open liberal democratic society. You can go and change your name down at the government office. Like, there's no like, oh, you can't have that surname because you don't belong to that identity. Like that does not exist. And so it's like like what you call things doesn't matter unless you actually value the thing, the label itself. And if you value the label itself, then I mean, obviously that I think is the road to ideological corruption in some sense. I mean, obviously in terms of language use, you want there to be some semantic consistency, just so that people can actually that's why conventions are useful, just in order to expedite and to save time and to facilitate what's the word, efficiency. But like, obviously all these things can sort of be more laboriously but yeah, I mean, to say that I want a night out with the boys, I mean, you're not saying that like boys are better than girls. You're just saying that like that is how I'm describing this experience that I have a preference for. It's weird because like a lot of the identity stuff, it's weird because the closest human way of understanding it is much closer to sexual preferences and sexual desire in some sense. Like, some people find some things attractive and they find other things unattractive. And this is why I also think feminism was at the core of this is that they that's a whole other sort of topic, but the idea that somehow the thing that you're going to extract the social justice from is somehow is basically the mind control of masculinity at a structural level, that somehow masculinity must pay for everyone's social justice, must just sort of freely dole out, and sort of it's been the masculine is strange because it's like men have done so much for bringing our society or for our species in a sense. Okay, this goes back to primordial biological sort of sexual differences. I mean, essentially, because men went out and killed other humanoid species of things that were close to human beings, but there were other species where their men and their women went out hunting shoulder to shoulder, and because our men were just by themselves in a hunting band and clashing against these other humanoid species, killing their men and their women, but specifically their women, while our women were safe back at the camp or whatever. That is how we essentially took over. That is how we became the dominant humanoid species. Is because we had a specialization between the sexes, and because we treated men as expendable, and because men have always been genetically expendable in some sense. Is 60% of all men did not leave any genetic offspring, whereas only 20% of all women didn't leave genetic offspring. So it's like, if you're a woman, you're guaranteed to stay in the gene pool, whereas if you're a man, it's like, actually the chances are that you're not going to continue, with, you're not going to pass on your genes. Like, you have to prove your worth. You have to provide value to the group and to essentially women who are, if you understand that statistic, women are the recipients of our collective enterprise, and men are by far the providers and the creditors in that sense, in that they have given that value externally, and I mean, this is the pressure that I think a lot of men, young men, can't sort of deal with, which is why the suicide rate of men is so high, because they don't want to enter, especially under the current cultural conditions of, sort of demeaning masculinity, is that not only now, it's not only did you provide all this extraneous value that you had to sort of pass on to other people, but now you should be blamed for doing that while still doing it, while still being expected to provide it. It's a bit too much of a mindfuck.
I don't think that it's that men can't deal with it. I think they don't even understand. I think they're at that level at this point, a lot of the younger men, where it's just no one told them that they have to be great to go forward. No one told them that, and society didn't recognize that at the same time. So, it's that's an unspoken thing, and it's just a thing that you unconsciously deal with, maybe.
Yeah, maybe from the 70s onwards, or from the 80s onwards, it was unspoken. Once women started entering the workplace and having, like more single children, they were the rearing of children in our society, the quality of it has sort of changed in terms of the value. I mean, because it used to be that you had to be a provider as a man, and now that sort of that categorical container is becoming more porous and nebulous. Whereas now, I mean, I do think that a lot of the suffering that men suffer from now, I think, is the inherent contradiction within feminism, is that they want it both ways. That they want to be able to, use their talents and competency in their work positions and get status based on their merit, like men get status based on the value that they provide. And then they also want to be able to sort of to sort of be cared for, and to sort of be catered to, and almost be bought from the sexual marketplace, and they want to be paid, their kind of their dowry. Is that the right?
Dowry.
Yes. Yeah. And like you can't sort of have it both ways. Like either you have to kind of enter the world of men and put up with that level of sort of that you're being utilized by your society in some sense. Like you are doing something for somebody else. It's not necessarily meaningful in the fullest sense in your own personal way, but that you're sort of providing value. You're being used by your boss in some sense, and you're and that is keeping the whole system churning. That's keeping all the cogs moving in some sense. And women have, in essence, they've been saved from that in some sense. I mean, with their domestic servitude and being closer to children, like, although that might have its own monotony based into that, I mean, just like the people that have to do, if you just look at the awful jobs that men have to do, compared to the supposedly awful jobs that women have to do, in general, they don't quite reach the same level of, that sense of that you are disposable in some sense. And like, although women, because they are communicators and they perhaps, are more feeling based or something like that, they don't have the kind of the critical faculty to actually empathize with people in other positions, that they just sort of they marinate themselves in this kind of the self-indulgent, self-obsessive, sort of idea that they should be able to get away with as much as the kind of the women that are able to trade their sexual marketplace value for a cushy life. Like that is the that is the average woman ideal in some sense. And if you aren't able to sort of trade in on that sexual marketplace value, then you are basically being hard done by the system in some sense. And I do think that feminist gripe was the core of essentially identity politics. But the problem is that it wouldn't even work. Like, you know, you wouldn't be able to control male sexuality to the extent in which, I mean...
Well, I mean, here, I guess I'm being the opposite of a feminist here in saying this, which makes me a masochist. But what we have done in the past was that women were the gatekeepers of continuum, basically, right? And if you liked a woman but she didn't think you were good enough, ideally you tried harder and you became a better person and you earned more money or became stronger or something happened that made you better, and then maybe she'll accept you. And if she doesn't, maybe somebody else will and you're better off. But what we've done here, or what we're headed towards doing, is this situation where, like, I'll say Google did a study recently. They have had this whole pay equality thing where if a guy makes more than a girl, they all speak up and the girl makes more now. What a surprise, all the women are making more than the men. Maybe not in entirety, but that's the general trend of it, is that. So if men aren't allowed to provide meaning by that outlet of, in the past, say, they could make more money through hard work, let's say. Or if you want to be a feminist, we'll say they were just given it by society for work, you know, less than a woman. Sure, let's go with that. Whatever you want to go with in that case. That's what they brought to the table, was they could contribute that. It doesn't work the other way around, because if men try to be the gatekeepers and women are the ones that are working hard, the same guy can be, you know, very good in the gene pool, very good looking. He can impregnate 50 women. The same woman can't be impregnated by 50 guys, so guys can't be the gatekeeper because you're going to have a weak link. And that won't drive society forward in the same way. It'll just dilute the gene pool to be smaller and smaller. And they're, like, I think that might be reached and realized in 50 years from now, that, hey, wait a second, it only works one way. Girls can be gatekeepers, guys cannot, because if you have one guy just decide to be a slut, and he looks good or has good genes or women like him, he's limited the need for however many guys he impregnated the women. And then all those kids just won't have fathers, so we go further down the rabbit hole.
I mean, I do think, like, in general, the general state of sexual courtship itself, and family values and family structures and sexual relations between the sexes, these things that I think they need to be updated in some sense, or not that they need to be updated, that's not even true. That, I mean, I actually like what a mess things are in, because it does give a dimension in which there is a tremendous amount of potential authenticity that might be created by two people generating somewhat of a unique encounter with one another and a unique negotiation, you know. Obviously, when you've got, let's say, perverse incentives for people to sort of follow trends that are basically what I would call fundamentally inauthentic or problematic or something like that, you know, like, I mean, you know, so in some sense, you know, like, hypergamy would not be such a big issue if we as a culture valued individual merit in some sense, you know, like to such a high degree that it would shine out and above sort of, you know, just like someone earning more money or someone having a fancier car or something like that, you know. So like all these sorts of, you know, things which are basically, you know, this is the fundamental problem, is that this stuff has always been driven by women. It hasn't been driven by men. Men haven't said like, aren't you impressed by my car? It's like the anticipation that women will be impressed by your car that creates the Ferrari in some sense, you know. You know that you know, so, or you know, or
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I was going to say that, you know, like, well, I mean, you know, that's not roughly. I generally do think that is where, in general terms, that is where the source of this is coming from. It's coming from that side of the equation. Obviously, certain individuals, some people will just be like, oh, well, when I was a child, I liked playing with toy cars, and I always really wanted a nice fancy car. And then some women that really like status and power, it's just basically a power symbol, but they wouldn't care that it is in what form it comes, but that it's just basically a symbol of a kind of high status or something like that, which is essentially what hypergamy, is kind of centered around in some sense, which is, I have said that women are in general more prone to this algorithmic thinking, where it's like, and it basically comes from the tremendous amount of cultural power and social power that they are handed at a very young age. So before they have matured, already they are treated like they're put on a pedestal, and they really have to jump through their own hoops and hurdles in order to sustain their idea of securing that pedestal. So they have to sort of work out their own system of how they know that the pedestal is under their own feet. And then they get obsessed with makeup maybe, or who knows what might think, like what sort of charms and symbols that they try to secure that source of cultural power. And so it becomes more about that and maximizing their opportunity, and like some women that are much more intelligent than others, or just much more intelligent on average, will work out that everything is a cost. Like they could go to university so that they could be around people that might be high earners in the future, or they could, if they are very, very pretty, they might want to become like a model so that they can try to sort of go out to clubs at night to stalk celebrities that they want to sort of eventually have a land a relationship with. So it's like you've got all these potential strategies of and they might try more than one strategy. They could have the fallback is that I'll find someone good at university and I'll go out to clubs at night to try and find the high status celebrity or something like that, which is a bit of a far shot. But like when this is your sort of your motivation and your incentive structure, it's essentially because you have this opportunity for tremendous elevation, just basically based on your sexual marketplace value, or sort of or that gets you your foot in the door, as it were, and like that, that whole system. I mean, I think is, I mean, on some superficial level, maybe it'll never disappear. Maybe it'll always exist in some superficial form as just a kind of the formality of working out, of should you be in the right room together, like do your interests co-align or coalesce, and then you can actually work out if you're, as human beings, if you can actually get along with one another, and like that kind of personal navigation of life, like that is a science in itself. And I do think that we have been held back now by feminism and women who have not decided to adopt the equality that they have eventually received. Instead, they still want to continue to create a structural complaint that they want everyone to be collectively bogged down by and plugged into, so that they don't actually have to be an individual at the club. They don't have to be an individual at the university. They can just play off their identity and just say, well, the reason why I'm not performing is because of identity, or the reason why I don't feel the way I should feel. It becomes a self-esteem vampirism very quickly. And I think that that's a way to insulate the very fragile ideological sort of and self-indulgent thing which allows people to continue to play the algorithm instead of playing life itself, instead of actually doing life. They just want to use the reliable algorithm, even though it gets more and more toxic, to sort of bring it up and to sort of make it relevant and say, no, I'm allowed to use these algorithms because this is the only way that we have right now, and it's your fault anyway, but I'm going to continue to sort of, to instead of like being the change that you want to see in the world, they want to see the change while being, the what's the word that means, like the instigator. They want to be the instigator and the director, so it's a very disembodied, top-down view of relating to everything around you. And so then they never have to live in their own skin and deal with other people that are living in their own skin, they're like, no, you must be plugged into this identity matrix already, so that I have a fallback, that if you challenge me in any way, I can say that you're being a bigot or whatever.
Yeah, it's when you see somebody fall into that, it's like there's no good response to give to a person that's falling back on that you didn't like what I did, or you're not totally in favor of me, so you're a racist. It's crazy. I had a guy. Yeah, it's definitely a power game. There was a guy once at an office. I didn't recognize him by the back of his head. So he started off getting a little bit upset. And then he saw that it was okay to be upset, and he saw that I reacted as if I was sorry and not in anger or anything. I was naive and stupid. I fell into that. And then he just got madder and madder, because the madder he got, the more right he seemed to be in the general eye of things. And he's like trying to figure out, how angry can I get at this person over not recognizing the back of my head on the second day he's been in this building, and the first time he's looked at the back of my head before it seems like it's too much. I'll stop here. This is good. I've degraded, humiliated, effaced this person, and now I'm the powerful person, and he's just garbage. He's a racist pile of crap, because he's not good at recognizing backs of heads. Carry on. It's terrible.
It is interesting how it has to sort of how it does have to sort of self-agonize in order to sort of, because otherwise it doesn't really have it doesn't have an interpersonal destination. It only has a kind of a structural vision about the structural outcome in some sense, which gives a judgment, and so when you have this judgment that just sort of it's like, what is it good for? So it's just like, it's a label system that sort of, like, you didn't recognize my identity, like, or you're not facilitating the right justice for my identity, like, and when that is the final point, that is the arbitration that gets handed down, it's like, where does that have a place to go? It doesn't have a practical resolution. It doesn't have an interhuman, kind of development. So it's like, it is scary, because it doesn't actually have, it's not relevant, like, it's really hypothetical and abstract, basically. The force of that judgment is completely abstract and disembodied.
Yeah, and it preys on, I guess, very civil-minded people that want peace. That's why it's deadly. It preys on the want for peace. Because I was a very pacifistic guy at the time. Still generally am. Like a month later, it bothered me that it happened so much. I apologized again to the guy. And I shouldn't have apologized once. It's just horrendous that you would take a guy that knew it. I know I didn't mean anything wrong. I know I wasn't trying to be an evil person in any respect. I'd seen two other black guys that were there, and I'm just not good at recognizing backs of heads. But, before that, I worked at a place, every work day, which is 4 days a week and 12-hour shifts, I drove an hour out of my way there and back, in total an hour, to pick up another guy who was black and didn't have a car. And I was going into this being this guy that was really appreciated by black people at the time. I've done a lot of things with the people in the place I'd worked before. It was half black people almost, and we had a great time. But then this guy comes about with this. I didn't talk to him aside from the apology at the time, doing work, and then the second apology months later. And it was just, it stifled and destroyed any chance of a relationship. We could have had a great time together had he not done that. But he did that, and then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, the hatred brought about by this kind of racism. You know, if I'd done the same thing and said, "Oh, you're black, so you're probably X," you know, same thing. He would never talk to me. I'd never see the good in him, and then onward from there. It's self-fulfilling so completely.
Yeah, and I mean, I mean, yeah, it's like the worst thing at the end is when everyone could just sort of agree about structural racism. You know, like that is almost the only thing that you can do at the end of that course of kind of exchange, where it's like, well, this judgment about, you know, this basically, you know, like you should have this collective guilt for your on behalf of your identity. You know, so as a representative of that faction, you have offended me as a representative of my faction. You know, like as soon as you come to that conclusion of an issue, essentially you're no longer people to one another. You can't be people. You are now both factional fascists that have to somehow practically engage with one another on some very very impersonal level. You know, I mean, it is the extension and the invocation of fascistic values into public life and into the kind of the moral and cultural, you know, I mean, it's completely unworkable as far as I can see. Like it doesn't. It's just like intersectionality. It like hypothetically would be great if we could all just say that there was one immensely rich person and we could all just sue that rich person for everything bad that goes wrong with our lives. But the problem is that no one has that much money. Like you can't. There isn't a person that can provide enough to satisfy everyone's claim against him. You know, like if he's going to if he's going to absorb all the accountability of everyone in the system.
Even if you could, it would take away all your personal accountability, so you would be less of a person for having that.
Yeah, I mean, it completely. Or this is a word that I heard Douglas Murray say, but it demoralizes the concept of individual agency or independent. Yeah, there's no idea of an independent moral agency anymore. It's completely collapsed to make room for the identity. The principles that possess and belong to the identity politics.
And if you did make your own morals, right, or you found a way to stand out among the crowd, it would be short-lived because you'd either be swallowed back up by the identity, now a stronger, better identity for you having done that, or it would be something where it just wouldn't be allowed in the first place.
I have a practical way I think that could make ground in terms of deconstructing for people the problem with identity politics, is that there is a hypothetical solution to identity politics where it will always be fine because people can have more than one identity, and so that essentially you could be, you know, like intersectional. You could stack up all your identities on top of one another in some sense, and that each one of them individually has a resolution against the status quo. And so the idea that because you can have more than one identity, then there will be a final justice. There will be a complete justice at some point that will be mediated by the system if the system was just justly administered by the right sort of moral arbiter or political, you know, kind of representative of some divine social justice on behalf of those on behalf of all identity.
Well,
yeah, I mean, obviously the problem is in the practice it's impossible because even two of these identities can't coexist with one another. I mean, because you see, it's fine when you only look at everything in comparison to the status quo, you know, which in my country they call white monopoly capital. If you compare every complaint to just the status quo, then you can hypothetically think that yes, we'll all get our share, we'll all get what's coming to us, we'll get what we deserve for the oppression that we've gotten from the system. But when you understand that each of these identities are themselves a system that are incompatible or that wouldn't be able to be, coexistent with one another, then the whole thing, so in some sense, the intersectional philosophy saves itself from becoming overtly fascistic, essentially, by not developing the kinds of thinking that actually say that this is how the policy should change. Well, I mean, I say that, but they do actually get some administration in some places, and every time they do, it's like the most unjust thing in the world. It has no procedure. It's all ad hoc bullshit. It's the worst kind of, like kangaroo courts, mob rule. It's the most kind of uncivilized demagoguery that you can imagine. It's literally pandering to the bloodthirsty mob.
It's like a vengeance rule, basically.
Yeah.
But I think one thing too, though, is if you could stop all the identity politics, I would say the best way to do it would be equal opportunity. Not in the sense of equal opportunity, we have to give these guys a step up over everybody else, but equal opportunity as far as options available to everybody to succeed. If you have a path forward that is good, and then I have the same path forward, but because I'm white, it's 5 times better, that's obviously an issue. But if it's based on something else like skill, and you can just try harder to get there, then it's not really an issue. It's just you not trying. I think the real shift we need to have is that kind of shift where we don't shame people for some mythical hatred of other people, and we don't play that game going down. We have to look up, and we have to move up, and that has to be the focus of things. Because if you focus on the bad things, you'll be tangled up in that forever, because you can always make something bad.
Yeah, you see, like, you can take some shortcuts when you talk about this issue, because in America, what you said, I think, is generally accurate. It's slightly more complicated because of the history of my country. Like, I do think that we do need programs of assistance for people, but they should be based not on identity or racial designation by some group membership. It should be based on, were you actually previously disadvantaged? Actually, wow, I just actually said the wrong thing. It's not so much that you're previously disadvantaged, it's that you are previously and currently disadvantaged. Because a lot of people that were previously disadvantaged are no longer disadvantaged, but they still tick that category. They still benefit from the government program because they can still say, I was previously disadvantaged. And this is the kind of the toxic identity politics right there, that like, assistance should be based on means tests. That, basically whether you get to attenuate someone's grades. I have a strong inclination against giving people easier entry into things. I think it would be much better to offer them remedial transitions into entering places, that instead of lowering the bar, you give them extra time to sort of digest the subject. So instead of so to me it makes absolutely no sense, like, to actually fill in what schooling they're missing or something like that. Like, if they have the aptitude, that you should sort of give them the tools to fix what was broken because of the previous disadvantage, if there is something that is still broken from the previous disadvantage. But the point is in real repair, not just giving people a status blindly because they can tick the box previously disadvantaged, and they're actually not really suffering from that. In fact, they've already been repaid that multiple times. I mean, there's a whole artificial elite in my country that are basically there because they are politically connected, because they are handed shares in some sense, because you just have to, like, by law, you have to be able to function within business, you have to have a certain portion of your share capital owned by a racial segment or something like that. I mean, it's completely insane, because it's just blind corruption. It's just like, basically, because one black person can be given millions and millions and millions of rands of stock to satisfy this condition. I mean, it's like, it's patent corruption, basically. I mean, it is there essentially for. I mean, there's a whole slew of they have this cadre system, which is how they deploy people into positions, and so they have these cliques within the ruling party, and they are so efficient at plundering the state that they have actually destroyed the electricity supply. We had one of the strongest, cheapest electricity supplies that I never had a power interruption my whole life, pretty much. For 20 years of my life, there was never a power interruption. And now there isn't enough electricity in the States. They have not invested in maintenance. They have not invested in generation. In fact, when they try to build a new power plant, they pay 3 times what you should pay for a power plant, and it still isn't built because there's that much corruption in the tenders and what they pay. Like everything that goes over budget. Like the money that they apportion for a project, at the end of it, it's at least double. It's crazy. And I mean, this, and we're a poor state that we would love, we should be investing more into education, more into the long-term development, the things that are needed for long-term development. But there's no incentive to invest in that, because if you urbanize people and educate them, then maybe they won't vote for you because you're promising liberation all the time. You can't promise to liberate people if you actually do it. So it's like they just continue to steal and use the race card, and now they want to take land from white property owners because they're white, essentially. They literally want to change the constitution to facilitate expropriation without compensation, which is completely unjustifiable, taking into account the history of this country. I mean, the mythology that they have created around land in this country is like, I mean, Hitler would be proud. It's like the blood and soil argument. And it's completely ahistorical. If you actually look at the real history and you look at what really happened, I mean, yes, land was expropriated from people, and like we have a land reform process that essentially all of that money has pretty much been stolen. Most of that money has been stolen. But I mean, like, it would not be hard to just put more money into it and to resolve those issues. You don't need to expropriate without compensation. It's completely unjustifiable. I mean, like, we use less than 1% of our GDP to pay for our land reform. And actually that would have been enough if it was just not stolen. If it was properly used, land reform would have been finished by now, essentially.
Well, that is a government problem. That describes every government I've ever heard of before. That level of...
Well, no, I do think we have more corruption. I mean, it is... Look, I mean, certain cultures do have more corruption more than others. Like the Italian state is famous for being a wreck, like the... and Greek politics as well has generally always been. I mean, some cultures are just. So, but I mean, like those are choices that people make in terms of their voting patterns. In terms of what they screen in their leadership, and what sort of things that they respect and such. But the racialist dogma has really crept in, and the fascists are growing in power. They increased the size of. They now hold 10% in parliament, and a lot of the ANC believe in the same things essentially, which is why the expropriation without compensation is going forward, even though it's patently unconstitutional. I mean, it's really disgusting.
That problem is much worse in America in that sense, and I don't want to say this in a way that approves of what's going on there, because I don't approve. I think that's awful. But to be fair to the point I made before of, people should have enough opportunity that they can have an okay life, What is the average life like for the black people there? Are they in poverty? Is it awful? Is it good? Is it very different from person to person? How does it work out?
Well, we have 40% unemployment. So I mean that's a huge problem. I mean that's worse than like the Great Depression probably. So it's like the main problem is the growth of the economy. We need the economy to grow, but the government essentially is sabotaging the growth of the economy because small and medium businesses essentially can't function with the racial quotas that they have, because it's hard enough just getting people with the right skills, and now you actually have to count people's skin color. When how do you have 80% black labor? How do you have a labor force of 80% black people if you're a small company of 3 people? You know, like it just doesn't work. So, I mean,
Well, 2 of them have to be black, and one has to be 2/3, right?
yeah, I guess. So, but you see, the problem is as well is that the headhunting, you know, so because the labor market isn't functioning like a real market, it doesn't have real signals. Because essentially, if you give someone skills in a if they're like, if they have a technical degree or they have like a proper business degree and you give them experience, suddenly they become valuable to the big companies, so they get headhunted. And so you can't retain your workforce essentially. And so many small businesses have essentially given up because, you know, when you're a small business and you have to replace people and you have to replace personnel, it's just too disruptive. And so essentially, like many people have said, you know, you can't have a small, it's too difficult with all the red tape and with the kind of the toxic, you know, like when people are getting promoted ahead of other people because of their race, you know, when that is such a huge meme, basically, that undermines the idea that like, that you're sharing a society in some sense, and it also undermines, um, well, so I mean, yeah, I would say that that's perhaps more a problem of bigger companies, but like the problem with small companies is just that the environment is too toxic, and you really need small and medium businesses to grow an economy. They are the growth factor in any developing nation. Like it's crazy. I mean, like there are developing countries often have growth north of 5%. We had -3% GDP growth essentially because I mean because the political situation is just so toxic. It's just, you know, and how they control the economic environment is basically sabotage. You know, so they've got so much racialist dogma pumped into how business is supposed to be run that you can't effectively grow the economy. You know, and you know, there are a lot of businesses that want to do a lot, that want to, you know, sort of almost, you know, create jobs and labor opportunity and stuff like that. But, you know, when you've got the kind of rhetoric from the fascists, it's just, yeah, I mean, it doesn't look good, I guess. But what's worse is that government blames business essentially for not existing in some sense, you know. So it really is crazy because they get a get out of jail free card every single time. They ruin it, and then because of the bad outcome, that's their excuse to have even more control. You know, so they destroyed our electricity supply, which is also another big reason why the economy is not doing well. Is because our electricity, you know, like our electricity supply has been very on and off. You know, like it's been very unstable. And and now they want to essentially get their hands in on the food supply. You know, so a government that was so irresponsible that it could not even preserve a functioning electrical grid now wants the power and influence over a country's food supply. You know, and my country doesn't just supply food to the people in this country. It, you know, it supplies food for a large part of the region, and it also exports food. You know, so food is a big industry here. But you know, like, you know, at some point you just have to be practical, and you have to work out these people do not deserve even to be in government. You know, like they need to have less power, not more radical power given to them for them to plunder and steal more for their own. You know, I mean, it really is like you know, they are stealing everything that isn't nailed down in the state, and they already have. They have looted the state so completely that now they are trying to go after a way to steal private property, essentially. That is what the expropriation without compensation, that is what is hinged on. Because, I mean, if it really was a priority and you wanted to preserve the economy of this country, you would just fund it more. You would just put 3% of GDP towards land reform, and that would easily solve all the problems. The state is the biggest landowner in this country. The state owns over 70% of all the land in the country is already owned by the state.
Well, I will say here the thing that was most enlightening to me was the idea of a small business needing to have 80% black people involved in it. So if you did have five people and one was a guy that, really knew what he was doing in an area and was not black, every guy that he gets and trains up and teaches how to do it would just go up to a bigger business as soon as they learned how, because why not? That's that's really tough, especially since I doubt they would really honor the guy because he's not black, and the rhetoric there is so pro them anti-black or white people. So then it would be impossible
Well, no,
to really
I have heard really heart-wrenching stories of people that don't want to leave their business. They don't want to get headhunted in some sense because they feel some loyalty. But I mean, that is not how a business works. You go where the money incentive is. You have no, but I mean, like, intelligently, you should follow the higher. If you're given a better offer, you should take it. That is how markets are supposed to function. That is how growth is supposed to happen. But because it's happening because of this mandate, because of this artificial intervention by identity politics, it is effectively destroying the labor market. It basically makes it dysfunctional. And the only way to protect this, right, is to say that no, it's justifiable. No, we need racial consciousness. Like, don't feel bad, just be racially conscious about it, and you'll see that it's appropriate. And so it gets worse and worse. Essentially, it's like a breeding ground for fascism.
I gotta say here, I mean, it sounds to me, from what you just said, that's the one thing so far that I found that might be actually racist. When you say they can't be expected to have the loyalty, the morals. Oh, it's so sad. I have to get
No,
to
no,
it.
no, no.
It sounds to me like they just have no morals, no will, no good in their souls if they do that to somebody.
No,
And
no,
they're just being
no.
just little pieces of crap.
No. You can't. That's not how business functions. Business,
But
like,
if this person gave them the chance, showed them how to do it, and the other company wouldn't have done that to begin with without them doing it as an intermediary, they are just shitting on this poor person.
no. But I mean, but commerce, business is not. I mean, like, yes, under the objective condition, right? If you want to take everything into account, you could say that, like, basically they owe it to them to stay in that situation. But then at what point does the line get crossed that actually they have generated enough experience that they could they could fulfill a new role in commerce, that like they've gotten the idea of the ladder, right? Like, business and commerce is all about ladder. Like, you have to have a shitty job before you can have a decent job, before you can have a really well-paying job. You have to go up the ladder, right? But because so, I mean, like, at what point are like, no, actually, now I understand this industry. There's nothing left for me to learn here. I want to expand my experience, because then maybe in 15 years' time, maybe I can open up my own shop, or do something like that. That is how you're supposed to follow the money. You are supposed to go for the higher paying offer. That is how business, in some sense, the only calculation you're supposed to do is you're supposed to say, well, actually, am I being offered more money with no chance of what do they call it, promotion? Like, that is the thing. Is like, where, if I take this higher paying job, where will it lead? Like, will it bottle my opportunity, or will it be a stepping stone towards even more opportunity? That is how business is supposed to function. And so if you can't follow the money, I mean, like, like, that is how markets work. They work by signals, but by signaling value and productivity. The problem is that the price signal of labor in my South African labor market has nothing to do with your productivity. Has nothing to do with your value. It has to do with this political currency of toxic identity consciousness. Yes, it's linked essentially to that. And for you to justify that, right, it is toxic and problematic both ways, because obviously a business owner will feel resentful when someone gets headhunted simply because of their race and not purely because of their productivity, or something like that, or
That's where equity creeps into
sorry, before expanding on that point, I just want to say as well that the yeah, so, when fuck, no, sorry, I just lost my own thread after interrupting you. I was just going to point out like a kind of a normal commercial sort of way of seeing how these relations are supposed to facilitate like greater structural sort of development in some sense that makes the whole economy stronger. Um, Sorry, what were we going to say about equity, Eskii?
Oh no, I was just adding to what you were saying, as in where equity would come in, as opposed to just freedom of opportunity. It's like we've got to make up because these guys have been oppressed over here. So rather than climbing that ladder, they take away that ladder and just put them there because of their identity and their oppression.
I mean, I think it is also horrible because you often, because of the headhunting type thing, you give people positions that they're not really competent to fulfill yet, they weren't really quite ready, and because they didn't have an authentic experience with commerce, they didn't develop their skills in a natural, organic way, and so it was kind of thrust upon them. And then to fill that gap, you have to fill it with basically identity politics. You have to justify it through some convoluted that your identity deserves equity, even though in your situation, like you're kind of enjoying that equity for your identity, so it's like, never mind like the mismatch of your individual instance, that mismatch is apportioned to structural racism, so it's a kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way.
Yeah, so like if companies aren't hiring individuals based off of merit, they're just pretty much shooting themselves in the foot. Like, I don't know.
The problem is that they have to do it, and they're more capable of doing it because the bigger companies are more capable of doing it than small companies. Like small companies often have unique positions, whereas bigger companies have these generic posts that that are bureaucratized within the current educational system, that anyone with that degree can sort of should be able to function hopefully in that role, although there is also a mismatch between what you're taught and often the role, the work on the ground. But in small companies often you see sides of logistics and you see sides of commerce which are much more integral to how to develop an economy in some sense. When you're involved in a small business, you often do a lot of different things, and that's why people depend on their personnel so much, because it takes them years to train them to be useful at their function in that particular small business environment, because you are often forced to be like a jack of all trades in some sense, very specialized. I mean, I've heard some small business owners very, very upset because they're like, when I hire someone, I'm basically paying them for 2 years and I'm not getting my money's worth because it just takes them 2 years for them to learn the job that I need them to do effectively. It takes a long time for people to become effective at the small business type environment. And so you really do invest in the person in some sense. And in this environment of headhunting, it just is way too destructive, essentially. And that is what is basically it's very helpful. So I was going to make the point that it's very helpful for big companies because effectively big companies are only threatened by small companies that are more efficient than them. They have less overhead. They can find niches. They can respond more organically. Brilliant small companies have a tendency of becoming successful medium-sized companies and perhaps then going on to becoming a big company with its own sort of thing. But we don't have that happening in our economy because the small companies are essentially undermined by the toxic labor dysfunction. And it's wonderful for big companies because although it has this added cost built into it, they are essentially constantly destroying their competition. They're constantly undermining the third leg of the table of the economy. And so they just stay as a kind of, I mean, it's bad, systemically it's bad for the economy, but in terms of, for big business and big government, it's great. It's great for them because, I mean, government doesn't give a shit about small business. They don't get bribes from small businesses. They only get bribes from big ones.
Well, I'll reiterate this point and I'll leave it after that because I don't want to dwell too much here. I think in an ideal world, you're dead on right. They should go upwards. I think they're crying and sad and whatever else that they have to do it because they don't want to look like they're immoral. But I think in that system, in that situation, doing that to the person that took it upon themselves to train you, knowing that it's hard and taking all that risk to do it, and being that middle ground that needs the support, and you leaving them because it's more convenient for you, that is immoral. And I think for race to be fair, for actual equality, that immorality needs to be put on them and not excused in that case until the system changes such that we don't have this problem and it's normal capitalism again, where you get a job, learn skills, and move up.
I understand, but I think it is problematic when the government itself is implementing.
Yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah,
they're living in that environment and they're doing something that is not the moral, proper thing to do. They're hurting people that help them in a way that is immoral. And to excuse it in any way and say, oh, that's fine, is ridiculous. It shouldn't be, oh, I'm so sad, I have to have a better life and you get screwed. Oh, please don't give me a better life, please don't. They want it. If they're doing that, they want it. And when they take that action, they've proven their morality, flat out. And it should be called out for what it is. And that should be what that is.
I think
it shouldn't be excused.
I think it's very hard to turn down more money for your work. I mean, like, because when you are offered more money, that is like, I mean, depending on where you are in the socioeconomic sort of spectrum, that can often make a quantifiable difference in your, I mean, like some people are supporting their extended family, like sometimes there is a job, one job is supporting more than one household in some sense. People have lots of family connections and things like that they sometimes become responsible for.
Somebody else's work family.
No, we have 40% unemployment in this country. Like the economy is not as.
It's because the small businesses can't succeed. So they're digging their own grave by their immorality.
Yeah, but you see, to try and fix this problem, right, you would have to get, a decentralized buy-in of all these individuals that have to understand this moral, the moral link of their individual action with the systemic problem. I mean, it is ironic because I would say that in some way there is an inverse, identity politics in terms of how it is promulgated. It generates a kind of an inverse moral problem which is conveniently overlooked, and this is the kind of the inverse moral problem that is just, it becomes invisible. If you believe in structural oppression, this fundamental stumbling block that is stopping the economy from growing, that could be overcome by individual actions. I think it's too much to ask one person to be responsible for the entire economy and say, no, I'm going to stay with this business because I want to promote small business in the country and help the economy overall. I think that might be asking a bit too much, especially with this ideological subversion going on of identity politics and all, it seems like it can,
Well, imagine that there's a law in place where another company can't headhunt somebody until they've earned 5 times what the realistic costs were of training that person.
I know. I think that would be too problematic in itself, because that almost sounds like that could be described as serfdom quite easily. I mean, like that would be.
Well, I mean, you're denying the problem then. It's like, I'm not saying they can't go somewhere else, but I'm saying another company can't contact it.
I mean, if you're going to
and say,
change,
"Hey."
if you're going to change the law, you would rather just remove the perverse incentive towards headhunting. You know, that basically headhunting. I mean, headhunting will still occur, but it won't happen for racial quotas. It'll happen purely for competence. You know, like when you're looking for the best man for the job or something like that, or you need someone to fulfill this job, and you've got that salary that you can advertise for that post, then you will maybe go to a headhunting firm to say, you know, find the person that can do excellent in this role, you know, for this money, and then they have to go find someone who's being undervalued in the economy, someone who's being paid less, who's more competent, you know. So, I mean, headhunting will always occur in some sense. Usually it only occurs in the very technical fields, you know, in terms of specialists and professionals. And managerial levels of you know stuff, but I mean when someone anyway, but yeah, that's I guess we've spoken about this enough. But yeah, I mean it's ironic that this converse issue exists, and it is almost the exact opposite of the accusation of identity politics. Although I would say that this converse issue, it does involve individual morality in some sense, but I do sympathize with people choosing more money, because like more money will impact the people around you in your life. You know, it will mean that you can provide more for your family. So I would always, you know, yeah, I would rather restructure the imbalance that is causing a systemic sabotage of the economy. I would rather that be fixed than saying, oh, well, everyone individually should just be more loyal and prize loyalty above everything else. Like economic loyalty, I mean, that's a weird concept. And I think that it is also antithetical to the proper functioning of capitalism. That if you are loyal to your boss, you are maybe holding a lot of things back systemically, you know, because you sacrificing your further success to promote the success of your boss, it doesn't translate into a win for the system necessarily. I mean, in this situation, it does, in very specific and unique, you know, like maybe the person has learnt everything they can in that role, and it would be better for them to try a new job. If that new job is a bit more than they can handle, obviously that would not be good for everyone, but it would still probably be good for the company because they get to check the quota box, so it works for them.
But well, I mean, I get to the point where you need to feed your family, right? I get that, if your family is starving to that. But I don't know, this is the problem area where low number businesses are worried to hire people and worried to try because of this particular issue. And that's, you know, it's oftentimes when we have rules in society that are not fair, people can make up for it in some way that is reasonable. Like if you have, I don't know, it's tough to find an example of that, but the concept I don't think is unreasonable. I've seen it in a lot of rules and systems where it was a little bit unfair, people recognized it and they adjusted for it as people, as individuals. And I get that in this case it could really be a tough choice if you're going to make double the money or something like that. But I think it is kind of a moral failing that's causing that to be a situation to begin with.
I think the proper moral failing
and then there's a moral failing on the other side too, so now you have a total moral failing.
I mean, I would rather just be more comfortable in saying that it's a moral failing of the government in some sense, that it's pandering to this ideological corruption which makes life very easy for them, because it promotes the idea that the identity will always be innocent, and so it can, you know, and so but you know, like when you're offered more money, that's not only going to increase your quality of life, it's potentially going to increase the quality of life of your children, you know. And
Well,
so,
what about Martin Shkreli?
sorry.
Martin Shkreli, an American that bought the rights to a very important medication for people, raised the price by, I think, several thousand% and got rich off of that while really hurting a lot of people. But it's okay because now his family has more money, right? Sometimes you can use capitalism in ways that are immoral. I think that's a thing that I've come to accept about our society. It can be done. It's a tool. It's not.
No, no, I do think that there are market failures that have to be attended to, but yeah, I mean, it is somewhat perverse when the government itself has the moral deficit and is actually making the market fail in this way and then creating a moral hazard for individuals in some sense that is a kind of sympathetic moral hazard with the government's ideological corruption. That whole system is, you know, is very perverse. Um, in so many ways, in that it feeds itself. It's kind of it's a form of self-feeding hate. You know, it's like an engine of identity consciousness that, you know, if you keep
Yeah.
running for long enough, then you end up, you know, in a fascist country. Um,
It does reciprocate.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting because on some level, I think that, you know, I'm somewhat thankful for this on some level, because I think then there are, at least in the experiences of a lot of people's lives, they have some internalization of an understanding of the kind of corruption that the state is engaged in, you know, and the kind of destruction that it's wreaking. You know, that this example, this you know, this is a very good example of the failing of identity politics in terms of how it will destroy a country and how it will morally degrade the soul of a nation at the same time, and how it will hollow it out, and replace it only with this identity in which everything that doesn't have to do with the morality, to do with the identity, is just an invisible irrelevancy, you know, and that somehow the conditions must always just facilitate the correctness of the identity politics, and the rightness of that way of trying to demand from and extract from, you know, the kind of the system that should just facilitate the rightness of the ideology. You know, it's weird how in some sense I actually, in my, when I make YouTube recordings about this topic, which maybe haven't come out so well as in this exchange. In this exchange, I think it's gone a lot more organically and fluidly talking about it. That the sorry, I just lost my thread slightly.
One second, I'm switching in my battery. My headset's dying on and off here.
Okay.
Sorry guys, I actually gotta like head out and do some stuff. But I will say I appreciate these discussions. Like at least we're having a talk about it. It just seems like especially identity politics seems to be something that people overlook very easy. But with that being said, thanks guys.
Thanks for joining, Eskii. Oh.
Yeah, no, you guys have a good day.
You too.
Cheers, have a good day. Is Eskii Australian? I'm just trying to work out his
I'm
accent.
not sure. He might be. I do think, I guess, I don't know, tangents in my head don't always connect at a right angle here, but I think that a long-standing belief I've had is that no system is ever perfect, right? And at some point, it will come down to the quality of the people in the system. So I think that's why that gets to me. I know I'm seeing it from pretty far away. I don't know what it's really like there. I don't know the whole experience. But when I see immorality excused, from my understanding, you could have the perfect government and you could still have a terrible system because people are just, in that sense immorality is favored. And I think in better systems that wouldn't be immoral and it would be fine. But when you see that there's a problem and you let it be a problem in that way and you excuse yourself by saying, oh, I felt the emotion, see, I'm a good person, and now I'm headhunted by, that does say something too. And to let it be a nothing, I think, is racist.
I don't think it is a reflection of the individual in some sense. I mean, I can understand the feeling of the employer, but I think it's sort of I mean, this is why people have given up making small businesses in this country. Like, I mean, I've known I've even heard some stories where this one guy got people to work for him, and he was like, he made them promise, that they wouldn't basically get headhunted after us, like, and they still ended up leaving at some point. And that, I think, is like it's having to have a system that can only be maintained because everyone makes the right moral decision is a bad system. You need to have a system in which, like there is a good enough sort of laxity in which, like, people can judge each other based on their character. But when there's so much of a perverse incentive, or actually, I'm saying the wrong thing. I should be saying moral hazard. A perverse incentive is actually something else. But this when there's such a moral hazard that's orchestrated by the state, like it has such a gravity to it that it's going to affect things. Even if it doesn't, to expect the majority of people to resist that gravity is going to be, I mean, like that's not how business even is supposed to function. I mean, like, even if a good portion of people, I mean, actually there are people that are loyal and they don't leave. I mean, like, I was just basically representing the general trend of this and the general meaning of it in some sense. Like, you can't expect more than some people to not leave, like, in some sense. Like, when there is, okay, so I wish I could remember the point that I was going to make about the, so I was going to make a point about government. Well, I'll probably, when I re-listen to this, I'll probably try to think of
Then
what
it'll
was
come up.
Sorry,
Well, I would say the thing that gets me too is, like, people might expect more of another race, morally speaking, and that's, to me, the kind of thing that keeps people down, is when it's like, it's okay to do this because you're X race. It's fine. But if you were another race, maybe not so.
Yeah, no, I do think that a lot of people on the so-called left suffer from that racism of low expectations or soft expectations, I think they say. No, sorry, they call it soft racism. But yeah, no, I don't, you see, like, because you see, if you're going to have a functioning economy, you need people to follow price signals. You need people to take better offers. And so, like, if you tell people that they're supposed to just be loyal, then you're fundamentally breaking the machine that actually does function when it functions. It's the reason why it's not functioning is not because, like, somehow you have to then you have to get people to know inside themselves if in ordinary circumstances they would have been offered something better, or if they could have found a better opportunity. Like, somehow they have to do that internal calculation in order to save themselves from that moral hazard. That is not a quantifiable problem. You're not able to sort of partition that question into yes or no, or sorry, into certain segments that you can then compound it and know what the answer to that question should be. So, to me, it's rather hypothetical, that kind of moral guilt, putting that moral guilt onto the individual. I mean, in some sense, you might say, in some obvious way, like, oh, well, it's obvious that I'm only being headhunted or something like that. But usually people that are headhunted are people that have some skills, or they have some qualification already. It's people that have done, that they've gotten educated, and they also have work experience, and that combined, and now they've been headhunted. It's very hard to get people in that scenario to not be optimistic about their vector, you know. And I mean, it's interesting because I've also heard sob stories of, you know, some people that have been working for someone, and then they actually rose in the ranks. Like they started, you know, like at a lowly post, and then while they were working there, the people there encouraged them to get educated and encouraged them to get, you know, like a degree or something like that, and then they actually took on like a managerial role, and then eventually, you know, they were headhunted or something like that. And that, you know, it's hard because you don't know, well, would they have been headhunted in any case? And to tell you the truth, the real solution, the real answer to a lot of these questions is that the people in this country that actually are really serious, good people that are really competent and really know what they're doing and they're professionals, they leave the country. Black professionals that are really professional, they don't put up with the shit. It's just too much of a mind fuck. They never mind the mind fuck of your employer. The mind fuck for the employee is just too fucking toxic, you know. So why try to be a finance person in South Africa when you can just fucking go to London because you're actually good at your job. You don't have to play, you know, oh, well, did I get this job because of the color of my skin? Fuck that. I'm just fucking off, you know. That's what really happens. And so we have a huge brain drain of anyone of any real substance. You know, they just flee from this country because it's so fucking toxic.
Well, I will say that it sounds like it's a problem that a lot of lower end countries kind of suffer from, is the bleed up situation. Where, you know, people say if you're a great person in India, let's say, you go to America. Or, you know.
Yeah, so I do just want to slightly disagree with you, not in general, but in this particular case, it is really a fucking crying shame because this country has endless potential. It is fucking insane, the potential of this country. You don't understand the competency and the structures that and the institutional sophistication that we have in South Africa. The South African state is just as powerful institutionally in terms of the competency in the institutions. I'm not talking about government, I'm talking about public institutions. Rivals European states. The judiciary in this country is really good. We have a stock market exchange, right? That is like comparable in its sophistication. You know that you can trade stocks on our stock exchange that are listed on the New York Stock Exchange. We've got stocks that are double listed. You can buy them on our exchange or you can buy them on the American exchange. There's no other exchange that I think has that dual listing that we have. We have business minds that are insane. We have businesses in this country that own businesses overseas because of their business mindedness. You know, there are people in this country that run things in China and they run things in America. Like, you know, we were a powerhouse. We were one of the superpowers. Like South Africa was a genuine superpower. We are a nuclear power. We had nuclear power, and I'll say this, but we secretly have nuclear bombs. Like, you know, if you ever look at a geographical world map, and it says the countries that are suspected of having nuclear bombs, Israel is in black, which means that they are very highly suspected of having nuclear bombs, and South Africa is the same color. We are the most suspect because everyone knows that we have them. In fact, we were the only country. We were the only country that actually gave up our nuclear arsenal. We had nuclear bombs, and then when the transition happened, we said we don't want them anymore, so we'll dismantle them. But you know, countries don't often do that. I'm just going to say that. But anyway.
I'll mention too, I know the Linux distribution of Ubuntu was made by Mark Shuttleworth, who was a guy from Welcome, South Africa. So, I mean, there's definitely interesting contributions from that section of the world. I don't want to demean it in any way. That was my introduction to Linux.
I mean, we had the best medical technology in the world. We were far better than anyone else. We invented the heart transplant.
That's a pretty impressive contribution.
Anyway, there are a lot of things to say about South Africa, but yeah, but obviously, it just sucks when you have a bad faith political class essentially that is using racialist politics essentially to just continue to with impunity plunder the state and plunder the future of this country, and then just get away with it and get rewarded for it in some sense, get rewarded with more power and influence over the economy. It's really insane. And like even the leader of the fascist party, he's such a corrupt person. Like his personal corruption is insane. Like the kinds of shade, because he used to be part of the government. He made so much money through selling government land in Limpopo with these crony capitalist people, and he's lived in mansions and stuff like that, and it's like the taxman is like, where did you get this money from? Like you've only been the president of the ANC Youth League. How do you afford a house that's worth that many millions? It doesn't make any sense. It's like you can't answer the taxman where he got it from, and then it's like sorry, my point about this is that and the hate speech, really. I mean, even just the hate speech alone should be enough, really, to make him unfit for parliament in some sense. But anyway, yeah. Okay, so I should stop ranting about this. It's not good for my emotional health.
Well, I will say I meant that in a way that did not mean to demean the country. I'm saying it bleeds up in a way that, as you've described it, where if someone is very good, they'll leave the country, it seems. And then also people that are good in lower business, they go up too fast in positions that are higher, where they may not be ready for them, and it's hard on the businesses that need them the most to really start the country's economy going the right way.
Yeah, it's a recipe for disaster, and it doesn't help that we have this moral consensus of identity politics from America and other places that essentially are the worst kinds of perverse incentive to sort of screw up a country and to sort of just derail everything and destabilize things for these ideological goals. You end up doing everything for the identity. This was the point that I was going to make. That in some sense, identity politics is efficient at creating identity consciousness. So, and in fact, it might even be efficient at creating equality between the identities. It's just that it doesn't do that by raising up the standards. It does it by destroying other people of other identities, So because it brings down other people, then they're more equal. And that point has been made before, but in some sense, like it does win, because the more it's used, the more right it is seen to be, because it does that essentially by demoralizing the sense of independent agency and debilitating the individual and principles of morality that get sucked into this vortex of identity morality. Okay, anyway, that's enough of me repeating myself, I guess. But sorry, I just thought those were good summaries.
Yeah, I do think that I wish identity politics would be focused the other direction. If it's going to exist, at least have it be, here's a guy of this identity or a woman of this identity, and here's this amazing contribution they have made to our world. Look at how great you can be. I guess eventually that would break away from it, because you'd find all these great people of all different races, sex, religion, etc., making good contributions, because that's the onus that is on you, is to say, well, I am X, and I'm part of that group, and I want it to be good, so I will find a cure for cancer, or I'll do something great in my community or something like that. But it seems like it's never used in a positive way. Only negative ways. And the only time it's used in a positive way that I've seen is by a place called BuzzFeed. And what they do is they find that a black guy put air conditioning in a boxcar on a train to transport food. It's an amazing accomplishment. It's great. It's very good. But then what they do to just add that hate in there, they go, look at this, black people invented all air conditioning. No air conditioning would exist without them. They're heroes. And they did the same thing with women in technology. And they've made some great contributions too, but you overstate the contribution so as to create hatred or dislike or to think that this is not about the right thing. And they say, well, a woman was involved in this one small portion of a cell phone, so it wouldn't have phones without women. And, they go on and on like that to the point where it's like you're living in a mud hut unless you accept that women contributed to your life, practically. They're like, don't walk on the concrete roads. Don't, and they take people and they abuse them on camera with, you can't use anything because women made everything and you're a scumbag because you're a guy or something. And that's the only time I've seen anything positive used, and it's still used in such a highly negative slant. If you just told me that, I wouldn't realistically have the idea of food shipped to me that is frozen food from far away without a black guy, that would be enough. I'd go, wow, that guy's a great person. He did a great thing. I'm glad he existed.
I think all of that stuff will always be problematic because essentially you're not celebrating the individual, you're celebrating the individual's identity. And that's also why they add that extra stuff on, sort of as a generalization to what they're specifically saying, is because essentially it's propaganda for the identity. And I do think that is, like, especially if it to me that is always divisive, to draw it's not a stereotype, it's a generalization, to draw a general rule from an individual contribution. It's that to me is fundamentally undermining the concept of dignity of the individual, is just completely overrun by the sense of you represent the pride of your faction. You're a piece of the pride of your identity faction. It's really demented in so many ways. In as much as you're going to do a profile on an individual who is doing some interesting work, have it be actually interesting. It actually deserves to have its own article. If it doesn't deserve to have its own article, if it's only there because of the person's identity, I think that already undermines the whole function of that supposed reporting. It is true that people need role models in some sense, but you can, so it would be nice to have some examples of people, just sort of, what they call it, representation, being diverse or something like that. But I think there's a difference between that and creating identity propaganda. Because then as soon as you create identity propaganda, it's obviously it's a contest of pride between groups. And already framing anything on that level essentially means that you're a racialist scum as far as I'm concerned. That is the worst kind of implicit racism. That is fascistic values at its core. If you are segmenting life into that, you don't believe in humanity. Essentially, you believe in different humanities. There are differing humanities, and they sort of are separate but equal, maybe at best. That is the best that you can hope for at that point. If you're that kind of racialist, then your principle of fairness or equality becomes separate but equal. Which is a phrase that should be tinged with moral degradation. It is one of the worst notions which is really at the bedrock of identity politics. That is their understanding of, which is, as soon as you have social justice in the context of separate but equal, I mean, you've got a monster. But yeah, so trying to create the window dressing, I don't think you can try to assuage that. I don't think that you can sort of try to counteract it by saying, oh, well, here's a role model of your identity, of this identity, so you should know that all these identities are equally important, or that these identities have done great things. Like, it completely overlooks the individual journey and says that they are just merely a splinter of their
faction.
Yeah, of whatever horned beast of their idolatry. That is the kind of, and it has to sort of have this equal power and this equal authority and dominion over things. It has to have its same territory as other things. It really is. I don't see how that doesn't turn into ethno-nationalism. It's really disgusting. So I mean, I would like to think that I've just described BuzzFeed as being a disgusting, sort of racialist, fomenting, gutter trash. But anyway.
Well, you hit my view of it too, as I was saying. If you're gonna do it, at least do it honestly. But I think I would rather the world you're trying to describe from what I see of it, where there's just no race anything, and people are just people, and if I see a person succeed, doesn't matter what race they are or what sex they are or whatever, I could then go, hey, I can succeed too, and then that's enough. But the hard thing is that how do you go from this world to that world?
Well, you see, the problem is that if you track identity in issues, right? Like if you say, well, it turns out that the people who actually are successful belong to that identity more so than some other identity, that you've got this statistical breakdown by identity, and you could say, well, then actually if I was a different identity, I could expect a higher success rate, a higher rate of success. See, this is the thing, is that they conflate statistics with reality, with pragmatism, with practical issues. So instead of saying, like, what do the successful people do that I'm not doing, they say, what does the identity have that my identity doesn't have, and then I need to get that thing for my identity. And because they believe in structural oppression, they therefore believe in structural solutions and structural. Essentially, they believe in a counter-structural oppression. They believe that, well, we just need to add the right kind of structural oppression to even things out. That is basically the thesis of social justice.
Yeah. But I think the tricky part to this, though, if I'm being fair and I'm playing devil's advocate here, let's say hypothetically we had a world where people just don't anymore. There's no, oh, well, my race, blah, 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 or your race, blah, blah, blah. There's none of that. No one even talks about race anymore. No one talks about differences in sexes anymore, aside from, a man and a woman, etc., But in terms of workplace or anything like that, it's not even an issue. If a woman wants to work, she works and she makes money, and there's no injustices that are done, no one talks about them.
I want to say something. I want to say something that's maybe slightly politically incorrect. Sorry, please get back. Maybe just jot down what the end of your question is. But I think in America, you actually could have gotten there. You could have gotten there much. You might have arrived there. But the problem in America was that there was no pressure put on black people to stop being racist. This, so you could get a good section of the culture to not care about race or to not invest into racial stereotypes and things like that, and just to work on an interpersonal level. Obviously not everyone, but you could get most people to do that. But you couldn't, in essence, get most black people to do that. And there was no pressure put on them to do that. And the failure of that black leadership, in fact, the the perverse black leadership that actually, like the Black Panther kind of ideology that essentially has never been challenged within the black community in America directly. I mean, it has been challenged, but it's never been successfully sort of challenged by a broad block. It's been challenged by a few voices here and there in some sense, but it's gone unchampioned. And the sort of that inconsistent sort of rhetoric there, and that I would say that weird kind of double standard, I think if that was challenged, then I think you could have already credibly made a lot more progress in sort of actually coming out on the other end. So, sorry, please finish your question now.
Well, the other part to it was, and let's say that happened and we challenged it and, we got to this utopian world to some degree where it didn't matter anymore. The hard thing there is, once you get to that point, maintaining it becomes that book 1984, where if you think any race-based thoughts, it's a thought crime, and then that's immoral in its own way, going the other way. I think, in the real world, people have to be allowed to think those thoughts, but then also understand that they're generally wrong.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you see, I think if you listen to the lecture given at Lafayette University by Hugh Coleman, I can't remember the name of the talk. I think it's something like anti-racism versus non-racialism. I don't think he actually used he said anti-racism versus some. The topic was something like two competing visions, moral visions, or two competing visions. And it was basically to contrast the social justice insanity with like what actual non-racial thinking is. I can't remember actually if he used the notion non-racialism, or if he used something else. But he was talking about those two philosophies and how different they are. And he goes into the details of almost like how you deal with things as a subjective viewer of looking at people, on a one-on-one basis, and like using stereotypes, not even stereotypes, but using generalizations, and that it's not wrong to use generalizations as a point of departure, but the point is that people should be judged by how able they are to make those generalizations how vulnerable to being updated by individual information. Like if you're walking on a street and you see two people that look suspicious and they are walking together, like do you cross the street, to sort of avoid bumping into them because that you think that they might mug you or something like that, so that is like a huge sort of racially charged thing, but it's like in terms of making a practical decision about safety, about like your actual thing. I mean, like,
it would be considered racist, but it's also self-preservation if you honestly have a concern.
Yeah,
and it's not right to make other people adjust their concerns to what you think they should be. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, okay, I'm just trying to follow some of your language about concern, if I can use that myself. But I mean, I'll just say that, like, basically, it matters more that you're able to talk to people and treat them as individuals. And, like, although you might have starting reference points, which are essentially generalizations, as long as you don't think that those generalizations are like objectively immutable, like, there's no problem. I mean, like, having a sense of general information about a society, or general information about a culture, or general information about a group of people, it might be useful information. But I would say that it's never useful when you're actually having a discussion. Like, I mean, well, actually, still maybe it might be a little bit useful as a starting point. You know, if we don't have a notion of what is conventional, then you have no way to kind of. I mean, language itself is conventional. If you don't have conventions, if you don't respect conventions as a starting point, you have no, you have nothing to work on in order to arrive at, you know, you can't efficiently get your concerns dealt with or exchanged or sorry, I need to think of a more general word, but the Coleman Hughes lecture, I think, goes into this like much more carefully than I just went into it. But that is like the basic thing. I mean, for example, there will always be general differences between groups of people. You know, like they will, but individuals will always have unique characteristics. You know, like just because your group is at a certain point in some statistical breakdown doesn't mean anything about any individual in that group. You know, like it's a complete non sequitur. You know, I mean, otherwise we would have to force all women to never work in some sense because they huddle around the mean and they're all sort of average. They tend towards being more average, whereas men are like completely all over the place. Like some of them are geniuses and some of them are complete idiots. Like much more so, because you know, like that's
how we evolve.
Yeah, or but and so I mean there will always be differences between groups that might be relevant maybe to medical science and helpful, you know, in terms of treating illnesses or knowing where to start to look for illnesses, you know, as to like what is the most probable issue that is likely to cause those symptoms in that group of people. That could be relevant, you know, in the same way that, you know, like, yeah, I mean, but, you know, like expecting people to sort of care about identities as an abstract holder of moral charge, I think that is fundamentally dehumanizing, and it sort of it devalues people on such a level so as to basically have this false idol of worship that you sort of that you must maintain the pride of other people's idolatry, and that you must hold out the idol of your identity and, you know, hope that it measures up in some separate and equal way, in some sense that each one must be given room or that one is greater than the other. It's
Well, I mean, that also ends up being a one-way transaction where one group of people is the one being shamed and told they're awful all over the place, and then the other group of people doesn't have to get shamed by their identity ever. They just, oh, I'm this identity, so give me all the land, and you're bad. You know, that's why it's so powerful, is because it's a one-way, ridiculous transaction that has been architected into play.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you have that idolatry set up, it's so easy essentially to say you are offending my idol, you are offending my idolatry worshipping ideology, and therefore you must make it whole again. You have sinned and diminished my idolatry, and your idolatry must pay for it. You know, so it I think that's also a good analogy that facilitates the understanding of how insulated people become in their kind of autistic narcissism, where they are so wrapped up in this identity and they can only see things through the gaze of that identity. They are just, you know, everything is a token of power between these idols.
Yeah, they ignore other things that could lead them to true prosperity, you know, better use of science, you know, jobs that would lead in that direction for their people if they were going to be, you know, all the things that really lead humanity to higher success when going down this route seem to be ignored by people that use it the most. And I think it's partially because and this may go back a little bit to what I was saying well before this about the whole bleeding up thing with the lower end companies. But in this system, if you have a failure of any kind, you can chalk it up to racism. And so it becomes a de facto reason for any failing you have. So the people utilizing it, they almost want you to fail. Because the more you fail, the more racist everybody else is, and the more right they are, the more you have to vote for them, the more you do vote for them, and the more power they have.
Yeah, I mean, the divine and innocence, the divine innocence of the idolatry, essentially exteriorizing all guilt. So if the idol is missing something, or feels like it doesn't have some pristine condition that worships it in the way that it wants to be valued, then essentially there is always a corresponding guilt attached to whatever is missing in the identity. And so your problem is not a personal problem, it's not an individual problem that you have to navigate life and try and find the means to navigate life and try find the assistance with your problem. Your problem is that your identity needs assistance. And the only way to assist your identity is by taxing other identities and redistributing. Oh, sorry, I've probably tired myself. This is my third day of fasting. I'm pretty proud of myself.
It's pretty good. Well, it's 9:50 now, so in the next hour I'll have to go get food at the store because they close at 11. But I don't know. I will say that you mentioned before that America was so close, all they needed was for basically black people to stop being racist. I think you would have taken a bit more than that, because there's all these other groups of people now that, you know, it went from where people were struggling for equality to struggling for more. That's what seems to be the general case. Is Martin Luther King, amazing guy, you know, he fought a good fight for a good reason. Rosa Parks, amazing woman. She did the right thing because there was really a problem where she was being treated unfairly, and she sat down for it, or stood up for it, depending on how you want to word it. But it does get to a point where it's more about the power of that you were able to fight for freedom, and it's never about the other people were good enough to give you freedom. It's never about, you know, well, now I have the modesty to stop because we have, you know, freedom. And you always find a case where you can, in America they have police that shoot black people. And I don't know the whole statistics of it, but I've seen some awful shootings that have been just terrible, and it's heart-wrenching. And it'll make you mad if you watch them, for sure. And, you know, I've rationalized it a lot of ways. I think it was just probably in a few cases they were bad cops, plain and simple. And that is racism, probably. Maybe it's not. Maybe I'm missing part of the picture. I don't know what it's like to be a cop. I don't know the pressures they face. I don't know their situation. But from the average Joe's perspective, it looks kind of racist. So I'm sure if you could find a black cop, you know, harassing and shooting a white guy, it would be the same basic view for me. Maybe some black guys who actually would say good. Hopefully not. But there's always going to be that impetus out there that'll make someone want to be racist. So that's what you're fighting in the long run, is that kind of character, the kind that wants to lash out at others. And then at the same time, as I'm saying that, you have to balance it and not have people do things out of racism themselves. But even in that world, there will always be racism, I think, or perceived racism, or something. And I'll say, in case I didn't say it, I think the same problem is a problem to fix where you're at, where if they just weren't racist, then things would be a lot. It sounds like that really is. You're so close. You have great institutions that have been historically great. It's just, it's being ruined by a rampant government utilizing racism to get what they want and to hurt themselves in the long run for a few people's immediate gain.
Yeah, it's interesting. The thing about the police, though, I mean, I saw a very good lecture by I can't remember. He's a colleague of Steven Pinker. I'm trying to remember what his field is. I don't know. He's some kind of scientist in something. I don't think he's a social scientist. I think he's a hard scientist. I'm not sure. No, he's a language scientist. Anyway, but it's interesting. Because I remember also having a discussion at some point with someone about the kind of the racist police problem, and I think I came with a pretty good synthesis of, like, well, I would, like, if you watch some of these videos and you don't watch it through the lens of racism, if you just, like, if you can just imagine, for instance, seeing this as an alien, like you see this video and you're an alien and you don't know anything about any history, right? Like, I don't know if I would necessarily conclude that there's such a thing as racism on this planet, or if I would conclude that policemen are dangerous. Like.
Well, I did see one comedian somewhere in like a montage of videos once on YouTube, and I never found it by itself. But this guy, he said basically, I thought, why do cops hate it? And then he said, now look at the statistics. And I said, damn, is that real? Oh, it's from the FBI. It is real. We kill a lot of, and he came to the realization that, wow, they really do end up killing a lot more people than other races. And I was dumbfounded that it made it to a video. I was dumbfounded that he said it. I was dumbfounded all the way around. So I forgot to do anything with it, like look at it or save it or anything. But it's just, it's very hard.
So I didn't follow exactly the point that you made. Are you saying that black people are killed disproportionately more when you said other races?
They may be, no, but I'm saying that, like, from the statistics we have, from the FBI, I believe it is, they end up killing a lot more than other races. And I think it might have been specifically cops or just in general. But the percentage of murder is much higher.
You're saying policemen murdering, the murder rate of policemen. Oh, sorry, that wasn't clear about what you were describing.
And this guy came to that realization that the police are in general, like, and then you start to, he became self-aware kind of in that way of, wow, we do kill a lot more people. Maybe that's why people are looking down on us. And, it's, if we're going to live in this world with racism, then, I mean, if everybody, that's the thing that's missing, is that humility. Or just, it's like I said before, you could live in an imperfect system if you had perfect people and it would be a perfect world, depending on how bad the system messed up. Maybe the system would ruin it still, but that is a possible scenario. I think when you see the people that have humility about it, it changes my perception to see it here and there. And then I feel like, maybe there's hope. But it would bother you, I'm sure, because it's still hope based on a world that allows racism instead of just non-racialism. But I mean, I guess it's closer. I think to get there, you need to have people that have that kind of humility and self-awareness. I think everybody would have to realize a little bit of the bad and the good to say, let's act in a world where we don't pay attention to this for a while, and I'll be grateful.
So I didn't quite follow your one point. You said my model was based on a world where you can have hope and that it allows racism. So, like, what exactly?
No, no,
Can you
no, no.
flesh that out?
I was saying that the one I was describing would not be your world because it doesn't have non-racialism, right? There's still racism.
Oh, okay. So are you asking, like, I still have
Well,
hope?
I'm saying that I get a little bit of hope when I see people that show that kind of humility in this world where we have racism right now. And they say, oh, my race does bad things too. And they realize that it's not a weapon to only use against others, but it's just a standing in the world, and that it can have bad parts to it too. Because when you realize that, I think we could evolve from that to a world where everybody maybe has that realization and that humility instilled in them of that their race has done good and bad things. And it's not just my race is the best race, you're all racist, you're all terrible, etc. And from that humility, we might be able to get into a layer above that where we just don't talk about race so much and race doesn't become a big issue as much. Because, you can say, oh, well, I could say, for example, oh, well, my race made electricity and we're amazing. But then I would also know, oh, yeah, we've also done bad things too. We nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki with nuclear bombs. And, you can say that's multicultural, but very white. We made nuclear bombs. We've done awful things and good things. And when people have that humility instilled in them, and it's their choice to instill it in them, it's not something someone else can do, really, then they'll be more willing to live in a world where we don't pay as much attention to that, and it would slowly turn into a world of non-racialism. But I think that would be the path, is that humility.
Yeah,
which I guess...
I still think it is problematic because to get people to issue forth that kind of humility or to sort of to comment on it or to come to that opinion or conclusion, already you see the possibility of a non-racialist paradigm in some sense, or a non-racialist framework. No, actually, I'm not giving your opinion its due. I mean, yeah, no, I think it is correct. Like, because if you do that, you already show that the idea of believing that your identity is the core of your perception in the world is itself a mixed. At least it's a mixed bag. It's a divided lens. It's not just a kind of it's something in which at least it's a two-way flow in some sense in terms of the identity itself. I still think that if you're going to be identity-centric, centered around your identity in terms of morality, sorry, I was going to make the point that identity or race as an identity is fundamentally, it's just a descriptor, and you're allowed to describe whatever the hell you want. As long as hopefully you're trying to be truthful. You're not just sort of making up malicious, hateful things that are meant to sort of designed to hurt people's feelings. But like, descriptions can be useful. They can be used as ingredients towards understanding practical things about challenges and obstacles, and it's part of explaining things potentially as well. But it doesn't carry any moral charge against an individual. It will never carry any moral charge against an individual. It might carry some utility in working out how to navigate or how to solve a problem. It can have a practical consequence and a practical utility to it. But like identity, and I would say the starting point of making identity a utilitarian object, and identity should only be a descriptive utilitarian object that has no moral weight whatsoever, is by first at least having the mixed moral proposition that your identity is both good and bad. But sadly, I'm afraid that when they teach people this in academia, that's probably the first lesson that they teach you, is that, like, yes, your identity is good and bad, but other identities are so evil that it's irrelevant. I think that's kind of the first lesson that they teach in their in their little, Nazi style gender and race gender and race studies or whatever they call it.
Well, I mean, that's a fault. You could say, of course they're attacking white people, right? They're saying white people are the evil ones and you're okay. But then if you do that, you gotta mention the goods that have been done. And if you honestly do that appropriately, I think it's gonna balance out.
You see, to me, as a factual body of history or knowledge, you can collect that information. The whole issue is that, do you consider it a domain of moral purview, or like, if you're tracking those identities as the locus of your integrity, then you're basically a fascist. I mean, then you are a racial. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you're a racialist scum. At that point, you don't have any humanity. You are just there essentially to be blown away by the winds of corruption of whatever leader is going to promise things to your identity, and everything that doesn't form part of that narrative just becomes invisible. You won't see the corruption.
Well,
sorry, okay, I'm repeating myself.
maybe a little. I'm just saying, I think that's the only path I see forward where we could get to a non-racial situation where we're not concerned with it. And I don't want to, invoke lying and saying, oh, we're all equal. Or I don't want to invoke lying and saying, no, this race was bad, but not so bad. Or they were good, but not too much better than your race, and they're good natures or good portions. But I don't know, I think, and this is where you run into issues where it's hard to form the idea fully, so of course there's going to be holes.
But you see, I don't think a race has a nature. I don't think you can make that claim, because the nature will always belong to the individual component of the group. And so in some sense...
Yeah, but you have to fight the current racism, though, somehow.
Yeah.
If you don't beat it down, no one will ever accept this world where they might have less power because their race isn't the most superpowered race in the world, and they can just walk all over everybody else because they're rich. They'll never step down without something of a realization and some integrity and some humility instilled in them in some way.
Well,
and then if you're the person that instills it, if it's, well, we can't do that to instill it, so I'll do it, then you get just worse situations. Because people think, I'll be the vindicator, I'll be the justice person that makes it now they see their flaws, and then now you look like a racist and they hate your race now, and it's set.
I just want to slightly disagree with you, because I do think that if you get people cooing along to the tune of like, oh yes, my identity has strong and weak points, or something like that it isn't just this kind of unipole goodness or righteousness or something like that, I still don't think that actually, because it really depends on if you're identity centric or not. If you believe that if you believe that the moral center of the universe lives in the identity, is in its core an identity, because that is how you express yourself in the medium of society and culture, is through these identity factions. Like, it's more that whole paradigm can only be, I'm afraid, dismantled from a principled standpoint of debasing the identity and saying, no, this identity will always be fickle, it will always be weak, it will never be complete, and trying to make a religion out of it will be devastating in every way, shape, and form, and it will create such a stupid culture that will, like the Nazi society is still having effects on modern German culture. It's so hard to come back from going over the edge like that. It really is. Like, their culture has still not regenerated. If you look at the kind of left politics that exists in Germany, I mean, it is, that's why they're so ultra progressive, because it is still a remnant of that morality. It's very
guilt.
No, not even the guilt.
Oh, not the guilt.
The actual because you really have to understand that the Nazis were the original social justice warriors. Like I'm not. That's how they see. That's how they view the world. That's how they break it down. It's not even a different value system to the so-called liberals in America. It is the same moral system. It is the same way of tabulating morality. And you see, you don't see yourself as evil. You're just identity centric, So, like, I mean, obviously, to individuals that actually want to actually have a meaningful navigation of life where you're not sort of channeling or possessed by this kind of the spirit of your identity, like, so it's a weird kind of spirit, kind of worship in some sense, that the spirit of their identity is the core of truth, is the platform of reality in some sense, and
ends up being kind of a guiding principle for them as a belief.
And I just wanted to say that, like, a lot of the fascist thinking does actually accept its own weaknesses, but it does want to do that in a private way, and that's why they want to create I don't want to think of another word, but that's why they want to create the homogeneity of an ethno-state. That's why they want to cleanse and make a safe space. You have to understand that was the vision of Nazi Germany, is that this should be a safe space. And so when they're in the process of doing that, sorry, I've just lost my thread again. Fuck.
Well, I'll ask a question then if I could here.
Yeah.
You mentioned before a utilitarian use of race. I'm assuming that means, if somebody has a certain quality just innately that's utilitarian, like maybe they are very strong physically or very smart or something else.
Well,
maybe I'm wrong. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is what I mean, is that you can't actually, there isn't a lot of utility to get from a generalization. If I tell you all human beings, as opposed to other species of other life forms, have these properties, these general properties, what useful information could you get from all of humanity? Like, in terms of knowing how we're different from other animals, so what could I make that would be a useful generalization? And so, like, individuals in each race, you can find easy comparables to individuals in other races. So, like, the idea that there's some generalization where certain features and characteristics are clustered is never really useful. It's only useful, I'm just trying to think, like, as I said, like, medical science is probably the only thing I can imagine that really that would actually find it useful, because then maybe it wouldn't even be that useful, because if you wanted to be a thorough physician, you would want to do a broad spectrum of tests to make sure that you found everything. But in terms of having limited tools or limited expenses that you're allowed to spend, maybe, if someone comes to you with this symptom, and you can statistically say, well, there's a high likelihood that this is probably what the disease might be, let me test for that first, like, kind of thing, like, so it doesn't really have much utility, but it's not inconceivable that it wouldn't have some utility at some points. Like, the starkest moral thing that I could probably imagine would be the kind of the crossing the street to avoid confronting two people in the middle of the night who, because of your racial profiling and your other profiling of them by trying to work out what is their status, or what is their socioeconomic status. Do they look like that they are desperate? Do they look like that they're doing something? And I do think that there has been a lot of self-agonizing sort of culture that has almost been created in African American subculture in order to be outrageous and offensive and almost to race bait. Like the kind of Coleman. Am I getting Coleman Hughes? Am I getting his name backwards? Which one is his first name and which one is his second name?
Hugh sounds more like a second name. If it would be Hugh normally if it's a first name.
I thought Coleman was his second name.
Well,
Hugh Coleman. Okay. I'm very tired and I'm fasting, so I can't remember. But he gives this very good example of what was I just talking about now? Oh, that's
person crossing the street.
no. He gives this very good example that black women are disproportionately owners of luxury vehicles, and statistically, black women have a lower socioeconomic standing. Like, black women spend a lot of money on expensive jewelry and expensive cars, and it's completely disproportionate to what they earn. So there's something about black women and sort of buying status symbols, essentially. And he's like, we have to start being self-critical. We cannot just talk about disparities between racial groups and disparities between how well people are doing in the economy when we overlook such obvious statistical data. If we're going to challenge the structural oppression, or we're going to challenge the disparity, but we're not going to look at the obvious thing, which has to do with people's own deliberate choices in their own lives, if we're going to overlook that, if that's going to become invisible, like, what the fuck are we doing, essentially? Like, it's a fake intellectual, it's a pseudo-intellectual excuse, essentially, to facilitate this identity idolatry, while, basically to get away from blaming the victim. But, so, and he also talks about the naming in African American culture, that people choose these names that sound foreign, that sound like they don't fit in with the culture. They're meant to be unique and to stand out, and maybe that is somewhat a symbol of how someone, essentially it's a tribute to the black identity, because the black identity is unique, and it's been put in this, there's obviously a sympathy narrative to go along with that, and it's this toxic sympathy that just sort of propagates more and more of this ideological it's a toxic element in culture, which it used to be contained to certain groups of people. I would say the French, to a large extent, French culture has been a huge exporter of this way of being, and it really has to do with their Napoleonic cultural adaptation. Napoleon really screwed up the legal system and changed the kind of statecraft that the French Republic has baked into it. I'm afraid it has the pseudo-fascistic premise into it, which is okay, sorry, this is too much of a tangent, but yeah, so he was just going into the economic effects of naming your children like that. Like, imagine naming your child Mark or John or Peter, as opposed to something that sounds like it, that you wouldn't be able to spell by
like
hearing it.
Jamiroquai.
Things that are, just the spelling, never mind the names themselves, the spelling of the names. Like how people invent the spelling of this name, essentially, so that it cannot be remembered. It cannot be easily, like, oh, let me just, write a note to this person and say, dear XYZ. You can't use their name because you have to literally find a record
You gotta
of
get out the phone book and then find their number in the phone book and then figure out the name almost.
Yeah, it's that level of sort of well, yeah, I mean, on
race-based individuality.
So it's like making that person a token of this kind of this racial, narrative around that is centered on the identity. So it's like you're going to make identity the most important thing to that person's life, essentially. So you're basically saying you have to go through life believing and living through this toxic filter of reducing life into what identity means. Like identity will have the prominent focus in their perception. It really is disgusting. I mean, on a lot of ways. And so I mean, like, I don't know how you effectively deal with that. Like, I mean, obviously, I would say the best thing would be if you went to a church and the church actually had some kind of moral instruction of explaining these kinds of these convoluted principles, because it is, it's so easy to go along with this if this has been your inherited culture, essentially, to invest in this race baiting, essentially, to this kind of societal malcontentness, this kind of the societal let's sort of show other people how unsettled we are by unsettling them, so that they can get into thinking about what they should do for us because they've unsettled our identity. Like that bullshit never ends. That is a drama cycle that just goes on infinitely.
Yeah.
Until it explodes at some point. So I mean, like.
Well, I'll point this out though too, and this is a hard thing to point out, but like, even if you talk about limited money for medical and they say this person is black, they might have this disease, right? And if that is known or thought about, then it can go somewhere further from there, and it's like you've just replanted the seeds basically. Maybe I'm superior to you because I don't get this disease, or whatever.
Well,
and then, or maybe they'll fire back with, well, I don't get sunburned, and then we're right back on the same road.
Well, you see, those things might be factually true. It just really matters where you put moral weight. Is there any moral worth in not getting sunburnt or not having so much disease? Because I mean, basically, we all get the same diseases. It's just statistical as to
Who gets them the most?
Yeah. So I mean, like, I don't see how that's morally relevant. I mean, like, you could make a case for that, but if you're already into making those kinds of silly arguments that are based on generalizations, I mean, like, what is the point of making a generalization an objective moral factor in your thinking? To make a generalization an objective moral factor, you essentially have to believe that, well, I mean, like, you essentially already live in a cartoon universe at that point. I mean, everything is a stereotype. You need to contend only with stereotypes. I mean, like that, or you want to simplify your existence to such an extent. But I mean, like, what is the use of that, essentially? I mean, it's because you want to essentially usually exploit a superficial morality so that you get an excuse to come down hard on people as a kind of moral thought crime police force. You want to be a field marshal for your pack, for your wolf tribe. It becomes a very clear there's certain personality styles that they need to do this because they're good at social manipulation. They essentially need an excuse to sell themselves to their in-group, because if they didn't sell protection to their in-group, they would have no function, and they would have no way to become the punisher, to become, they have a kind of sadistically edged psyche, and they need to find a way to they need a victim for that. They need to find a place to put that to use, and they need to be glorified for doing it. And this is the people like Hitler. This is the people like Julius Malema in my country. They are natural fascists. They need a superficial group morality to disguise themselves and to disguise their corruption.
Yeah, I see what you mean with that. That generally is how it seems to go. And even in like groups of high school girls, they'll find one person to be the bad person or whatever. Well, high schoolers in general. It starts early in people, I suppose.
I mean, it's sad because these people constantly do this throughout their life, and they often have many different circles of people that they cycle through, and they try not to get those circles of people to interact with one another, because they often tell different stories to different people, and they fabricate different things because they have multiple webs, being spun at the same time, and they actually need other people to go through drama to see their own thinking, because they can't actually connect with their own internal world. They have to see it played out through other people, and they will often go through tremendous acting of emotion. They will cry and break down. They will use any kind of, it's like the same borderline personality kind of manipulation, and they don't actually even believe it themselves. Like, they don't even believe the truth of the premise of what's going on, but it was just too good to pass up. It was too good not to sort of to try and control the narrative, essentially.
Yeah.
But I was also going to make the point that these people, they need actually to be a subculture. They cannot control the system. These are the worst people to have in control of a society. It's fine if you are, like a mafia mob boss, right? If you are the godfather and you're like always talking about how hard your people had it because you tried to open your little Italian business shops, but the other people, they weren't having it, and they wouldn't let us be successful. So obviously we had to put a gun to their head and sell them protection, and then that's how we became rich, because they wouldn't let us succeed any other way. It's that kind of false dilemma. And so it only works when you actually have a functioning economy to steal from. But when you are the leader, when you are controlling things, then, like, who do you have to blame? Then it becomes a civil war, basically. Then you have to identify a group of people within your control that is to blame, and then, you scapegoat them, and then, you get what we have with identity politics. But thank goodness, no one from the left in America has taken over yet. And in my country, the president is kind of sitting on the fence. He pays lip service to identity politics. He has said a lot of things that are compatible with identity politics, which I find a distinct betrayal of the South African vision. It's a distinct betrayal of non-racialism. It's very disgusting, but he's tried to play both sides, because a lot of his own party essentially are fascists, and we've got a fascist party that is openly giving the fascist rhetoric, and he basically has to sympathize with it about half the time. So,
well, at least you're near the end of it, though, because once they mess up the food supply, at some point the country's got to go bust. When you have too negative an economy, it doesn't matter how rich a few people are, eventually it goes away. And then something else has to be there. So the winds of change will hit. I think with America, we're getting more and more of a crazy left that's coming up. Like Ocasio-Cortez, if you heard of her, I'm sure you have. She said that zucchinis are racist. If you garden and you grow zucchinis instead of a more, culturally sensitive crop, because zucchinis are so white. Maybe it was cauliflower. It was cauliflower, I think. But if you grow cauliflower, it's just such a white. It doesn't let other people know they can grow other foods that are not cauliflower. So you're really hurting them by growing cauliflower. So it's racist to do that. And then we have another guy. I forget his name off the top of my head, but he's going over to Mexico, and he's campaigning for his presidency in Mexico, saying basically that he's going to let all the Mexicans in, in whatever dog whistle words he can, trying to get them to come over to America and vote for him, even though they're Mexicans and not Americans, because he thinks that'll work. And it's becoming unhinged so much. And this guy says that we, as of course mostly white people, are to blame for the migration to America because it's due to global warming. And it's our fault. And, he just, whatever he can do to twist the narrative in his favor in that way is what he does.
Yeah, big environmental factors like global warming stuff it plays into the narrative of identity, because it's sort of, not exactly directly, but it leads to the thinking that let's not think about individual morality and individual principles of morality. Let's just the only way that we're going to solve our problems is if we do it from a structural level, and we have to do it. We just need to simplify the problem, basically. And so everyone should just be saddled with their identity, and we should work it out through identities, because that is the only way that we're going to have enough strong-willed kind of dictators, or a strong enough politics that will be able to sort of sort things out for the system, because we're going to give them a free hand to control the system, and then they can do things for the identity, and they can do things for the environment more easily, if we can just segment ourselves nicely, into the simplified narrative and drama. So I wanted to bring up the point about rights, but I think that it was in the recording. I think I did talk about that on this server, yeah. About the euthanasia, and how as soon as you remove moral principles and challenges from the individual and you replace them with identity principles, you can give individuals whatever right you want, and it doesn't even matter like how problematic it is in terms of the right not to be offended, or whatever, or the right to kill yourself, euthanasia, by the state, even if they are people. There are people campaigning in Europe for the right for teenagers that have mental problems, mental illnesses, to be able to kill themselves with the assistance of the state. I heard that from Doug.
Yeah. That's pretty bad. Teenagers?
Yeah, adults can already do it, but they want teenagers to be able to choose.
Wait, where was this again?
I think it's in the Netherlands. But in two countries, euthanasia is already legal.
It feels like, and I hate to put it this way, but it feels like the goal is just to attack the general idea of a culture that is made by white people. Even in a non-racial world, there would still kind of be different cultures currently, And the culture that is more centered around white people is the one that is just under attack everywhere.
Well, I think that is arrived at for two separate reasons. The one is that the culture itself professes to be non-racial and multicultural in some sense. It promotes the value of tolerance, and it promotes the idea of individual rights, and that whole thing is completely antithetical to identity consciousness and therefore identity politics, and so it's a natural thing that needs to be attacked. And then I think that is the primary reason as to why it is attacked and denigrated. And it's labeled white merely because that is what you would have to label it if you are identity-centric. So it's referred to as white culture, but I don't think that is the reason why it is targeted.
You mentioned before, Western culture is more an appropriate word.
Yeah, well, I thought that it was, to me, that's a more appropriate designation. I mean, it doesn't make. I mean, are the Greeks white? Are the Italians white? Are I know, like there's a lot of thing in Western culture which is not really. I would say I wouldn't. I don't see the value in racializing it.
Yeah, but that's a good point to have made back then and now. I will say that, like, the boundaries in my mind of what counts as white, Italian people, Irish people, Scottish people, sure. And it used to be in America, those people were persecuted and treated badly. But I've seen people that are black that I think were rather white in that context. Maybe rather Western culture would be a better way to put it, but it seems awkward to my brain to do it because it's been years of just that reality foisted upon me.
It's very interesting because in some of the racialist theory they say that it's whiteness that needs to be destroyed. And I'm sympathetic to some of that argument, but they mean it in a very different way in the way that you are using the word white, or how you were just referring to it. Because in some sense I do believe that everyone can become white in that sense, but I do think that it is a demeaning label. It is a demeaning way of categorizing essentially the best of civilization that has eventually, been developed primarily in the West. I'm just trying to think if I can think of anyone who really contributed to that development, that was non-Western. But I do think that like the liberal political philosophy is pretty much Western. Um,
And I mean, we borrowed from Chinese philosophy, I'm sure, in some areas here and there. Um, as I understand it, we didn't make the concept of zero. That was more Arabic, I believe. But there are things other cultures have done that are good too.
yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just talking about political science. I'm not just talking about general knowledge in some sense, or philosophical knowledge in some sense. Because even though, I mean, no culture could probably best the Indian culture in terms of their philosophical sophistication, although I do think that they have even suffered from some of that over development in some sense, because I think they came to some wrong conclusions. I mean, the traditional Indian society, I mean, I you know, it's funny because you have the same thing like I was talking about the subculture in Britain, but in India you have also a lot of people that are very resentful of the British that came into India. But I mean, the British actually, I mean, they did exploit and they did do a lot of things that were definitely evil, but they did also a lot of good things in sort of modernizing India. I mean, there are a lot of people that effectively they saved and liberated from what is still pretty bad conditions. What are called the untouchables. The caste system in India is incredibly barbaric, and it still has not been fully uprooted. But they would have been nowhere close to where they are today, but for the British. The British. I mean, if you actually talk to them politically, they will they are very thankful for the British influence in their society, because they actually use the liberal political philosophy in some sense that was brought over by the British as the key to their liberation, at least their individual liberation, because their traditional oppression is really, I mean, it's disgusting. It really is. It's very, I mean, if you want to think of, so I mean, for the vast philosophical sophistication that India has, I mean, that is really juxtaposed with some of the most, like they really had the kind of politics and traditional structure in India has well, I guess you'd have to talk about it in carefully, sort of, but it's certainly the idea that there were these pristine cultures that existed before Western influence and that were only sort of ravaged by Westerners or something like that. It's so ahistorical. There's this. There's very toxic politics in South Africa over these issues because they've been rehashed so many times, because people complain about the European colonialists, which this hate comes essentially from the academic racialists, the academic fascists that push these crazy narratives, and they don't look at it in a balanced way at all. They look at it only through identity and only through proving the kind of the identity morality, and it's they cherry pick their the idea of how consciousness develops around race and things like that, just to basically create this concrete political vehicle essentially and cultural vehicle that is intrinsically fascistic.
I'll say that what I've said, it sounds to me like in your views is racist in a lot of ways. And I can't deny that I live in a world where everything is racist, so of course I'm going to be racist. How could I not if I'm white, right? But I do think, and it's hard to say it, I can't think of another way for people to get to non-racialism aside from some magical moment where they all get struck by lightning and ascend into the heavens, than for, I don't know, I think temperance, humility. Everybody, people made the construct of white guilt a thing, and now all white people are guilty of everything. What about guilt of other races? It doesn't exist. There's no Mexican guilt, Hispanic guilt, black guilt, Italian guilt. It's just generalized into white people. I guess, Italians usually are too nowadays, it seems like. But, there's no Eskimo guilt, there's no Native American guilt, Indian guilt, Asian guilt. It's only white guilt. And,
Yeah, well,
maybe
it's important that there is only one scapegoat, because, or only one thing to extract from, because otherwise it would be impossible to imagine that multiple different identities will be able to get a slice of the pie. Because if they all have counterclaims against one another, that entanglement and that hypothetical mess just makes it fundamentally unworkable, which it fundamentally is unworkable. But you can only conceal that by having a single target, essentially. But I just wanted, sorry, I didn't understand exactly. You said, from what I was saying, or something like that. From what I said, I see. Were you saying that I think I can't remember. But your wording sounded like you said that I said something racist, or that I have a lot of racist in my thinking, or something. Or were you saying that I see a lot of racism? I label a lot of things as racist. Is that what you were saying?
I think in a lot of the things that you said, the things that I have said, were basically rebutted in a way that made them seem a bit racist. And I understand that. I'm not saying I'm offended by it. But I am saying I see the point as to how they are a bit racist. I'm not being non-racialist because I'm trying to look at the world from the perspective of there's racism everywhere. How do you get it to a non-racial standpoint? And to do that, you have to address racism a little bit. If you take too high of a road, you'll never be down there with the people that need to become non-racial for it to be a non-racial world. And so, if you go about it from too high of an ivory tower, your voice won't reach them, I guess would be a way to put it. But those are the people that need something to entangle it. They need it to be, as you just said, if there's more than one scapegoat and it doesn't work and everyone thinks, oh, this won't work, they won't want it anymore. That's what you need to end it, is an attack, kind of, not a violent or vicious or mean one, but one pointing out, what about what you guys did? Isn't that awful? Shouldn't you be ashamed? That's the only way I can see it, to where people will give up this free, excessive, amazing social status of being a victim class and just getting everything they want.
I mean, sadly, the best, contemplatively, the best way to solve this problem, right, is you say, AOC, what's her name, Alicia something Cortez.
Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez.
Okay, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. If you make her the president of the country, and you just say, okay, look, you get to be a dictator, you get to do whatever you want, and then she'll institute socialism and she'll change everything, and then in 50 years' time, you say, now you see what a mess that was, you see how awful that was, you see how we shouldn't have done that. But obviously, you can't just do that. But like that is sadly, in some sense, the only way to really destroy them is to give them power and to watch them fail. The problem is that they can't fail legitimately. They will always go to war with the world, because if they fail, it just means that they were structurally oppressed, and so that they needed to actually to extract from the guilty party, which they are in war with, so they just basically complain that they are in this perpetual war, and that there's always this antagonist that is essentially ruining their self-righteousness, so they can never be wrong, and they can never not deliver. They just need more power. That's always the excuse, is that they need more absolute power. And then, you give them more absolute power just to shut them up, and then somehow they control your mind even more, and they're even complaining about more things, and then actually you become the enemy, which already kind of exists in some implicit sense, is that like your mind has been colonized. That's what they tell people now at university in my country. They're like, it's not just society that needs to be decolonized, it's the mind that has to be decolonized. And like your you're not radical enough, you know, like you're not on the wave of progressive thought, you know. It's really scary. Anyway, I think I've talked
Well,
myself out. But sorry, if you.
I'll give a closing statement here. I think you're right about if you gave her that and she had socialism for the next 50 years, what would happen, given the current status quo, is that all the white people would be making it fail because they're racist. That's how it would be portrayed. Even if it failed on its own completely, that's what they would do. Is they made it fail because they couldn't stand a proud Dominican or whatever woman being given a shot at success, and they wanted to spite her. And it'll be like all these people are now starving to death because they wanted to spite one person so badly. Will be how they play it out. So then you won't end up with a system where they've learned anything. And I imagine if she got that chance and she's racist to begin with, you know, she won't just use that narrative. She'll start to believe it herself, and other people will too, and then it'll just worsen the situation as the failure happened. I think that's why I like the idea of a tempering more than a shot at failing where you have a free way out. You need to take away the free way out by saying, hey, that's not right in some way. And it takes such courage to do. It's amazing.
So I just want to add to that point that I think that because when you are running this political ideological machine, because it can never be wrong, because it's so easily able to divert blame and just to create, you know, like, oh, it's just an even bigger conspiracy against us, or we've been infiltrated, or they're ruining it for us, even though we should be winning, but they won't let us win, you know, like, because it's so easy to always use rhetoric to avoid any kind of self-criticism. It's so perverse in that way that eventually the leadership ends up taking risks. It's the same way that Hitler went in against Russia, because he was like, well, rhetorically I can never be wrong, so I have to know that God is on my side to prove my rhetoric correct, because, to myself. I do think in a sense Hitler had to prove it to himself that he really was on the right side of history, or on the right side of the divine, or that he had some kind of divine permission in some sense, because he was effectively claiming that in his rhetoric. And implicitly that is the claim, that I am representing my identity as its savior. I'm the Führer of blackness, or the Aryan race, or whatever it may be. I am going to be the savior of this, and this is the destiny of my people, and therefore divinity must be on my side, and so I have to prove it to myself somehow, because the rhetoric is so concrete, it's so absolute, it's so totalitarian, that the only way to prove that you deserve that kind of power over your own people, over controlling their minds in that way, over being able to just sort of reframe things to never be wrong, you actually have to make a gambit, and you have to sort of, you know, and it's sad because it is like a cancer. It has a tremendous growth factor in it, which eventually metastasizes and kills the host. You know, so it's like, this is why, at the earliest opportunity that they possibly could, I mean, Hitler tried to have a coup and he failed and he went to jail. Then he tried to have a coup again and he succeeded. You know, so they are chomping at the bit. At the earliest opportunity, they are very keyed in, you know, and their ideology looks very attractive to people because the identity-centric morality is just too easy.
Yeah, well, the thing with Napoleon, though, was he was proven wrong. God was not on his side. He didn't make it through. And then, in the end, you have to say, yes, Napoleon was not God's gift to the world. He was not the sacred one. He was incorrect. He was just delusional. And the fact is right there. But with the way this is set up, it never has to come to truth moment. And it could just be white people sabotage me, they're the worst. Gotta hate them even more, they ruined America. Oh man, you know, and it doesn't have that cathartic moment where there is a release from this insanity. it would just keep going, but be bad for everybody.
Well, this is how the Nazi state operated psychologically. You know, they, even as they were winning the war, they had to reinvent the Jewish conspiracy against them, like just to keep the ideology alive, because it's so fragile. To keep that worldview in focus, you have to have that single target in view, essentially. And you know, like, yeah, so I mean, perhaps in this form it might be more stable if it ever gets in power. It would be very dangerous because essentially that the kind of power that gives your political elite, you know, it's the exact kind of political power that is associated with Hillary Clinton, you know, the kind of the I don't know what they're called, you know, the Wall Street Club or whatever you want to call them, you know, like it's you know, well, now it's the Silicon Valley people, you know, it's like it has this disgusting sympathy with the so-called activists and the so-called politically conscious individuals, you know, which essentially are rooting for this political faction which will exploit them the most and just pay lip service to their identity, because essentially it's cheaper to pander to an identity than it is to actually deliver real change and real progress, you know, like in terms of actually growing things and doing things for small business, because you know that doesn't enrich the Wall Street Club. Essentially it enriches the real economy, and you know that's not important to them.
Yeah, and America does have that kind of a. We had the Donald Trump brought in all the money from foreign places, right? As a huge tax write-off, or well, much less charge to them to bring it into America and repatriate the money. And then you find that with that money, Apple is just free buying their own stock. You know, they're just giving the money away to the stockholders rather than doing something productive and making more jobs and spurring the economy directly.
Well, still,
So
it might indirectly still get into the economy because
Oh yeah, some of it will.
I mean the stockholders will have to find something to reinvest in after they sell their shares back to the company.
Well, I mean that's true, but it's also kind of like, are those stockholders in America or not?
Well, even if
Because
they're
if they're in Spain,
well, even if they're not, if America is an attractive place to invest, then it will attract investment nonetheless.
yeah, but it is a manipulation and a perversion of the market to just buy your own stock back in that way, I think.
And I think you see, like, I've wanted to raise this issue with you, although this is a completely separate issue in some sense. So welcome back, Eskii.
you guys are still going.
We were trying to wrap up twice now. but
That never comes along, huh?
yeah, just keep on finding more interesting things that I like to pontificate about. And then Arcade is really good at describing things like in a. Yeah, he really gets into nice. He grounds me a lot, and he also summarizes what I've said in much more concrete language, which I really appreciate. But what I was going to say is that at some point, the only tool that you have over a system or a society is making a law that is applied evenly and without favor. And although you can say, oh, this law had an intention and it had a spirit, you have to be governed by law. And so you can say that maybe the policy could have been worded better. Maybe there was no better way to word that policy. And maybe, you know, it won't accomplish everything that it wanted to intend, or it won't be as 100% effective according to the spirit or the intention of why it was created. But like, I don't know, I don't think you can hold a kind of moral animosity for people essentially using the tools available that were made, you know, because in some sense it has to be able to organically hang together. And I don't think that generating this kind of structural resentment that people are sort of being bad actors. I think in some sense, if people are legally bad actors, fine, let them be legally bad actors, because that is the only way that we're going to find a way to circumvent that problem. That is the only way that we're going to find a better way of doing it, or an alternative, facility, because if people are enough bad actors, then you can try to create a policy solution. Although, like if it's not an intelligent policy solution, it can end up creating worse problems. And a lot of the state is the history of that. We would have been a lot better not solving problems in a lot of instances.
Well, I stand kind of by my belief a little bit. I think that the first tenet of what I'm going to say is that you can always find a new legal way to do something that is immoral. It's always possible. In 2,000 years, if we're still going, it'll be possible to find a new way to do something bad that is immoral and obviously wrong, but legal. We'll never get them all. And then the second thing is, the more laws you have to introduce to a society, the more likely you are to get something wrong, and the more chaos that ensues from these laws being introduced. So,
well, time is always changing. Like life is always changing and evolving. So you're always going to have this.
Yeah, but there still are like Martin Shkreli is my example from before, and he still makes sense. The guy bought a medication that people need to survive and jacked up the price by like 1,000% or more. And it's obviously immoral. It gained him money in our society. You can legally do that, but he's really hurting people in a way that is just not fair. And I don't know, I would say objectively, I think there's no human being that would see that and go, that's perfectly right. Like, your gut reaction will be that no, it's not right. He's potentially killing people for profits. And there's nothing wrong with the people in terms of morality, they're just people.
Yeah, that is a very interesting case. I wish I knew the specifics about that. I mean, in my legal system, there would be multiple solutions to that particular problem. So like that you wouldn't have to seriously change the law in any way in order to solve that problem in my country. I think maybe even in your country there might be measures that could be used essentially to alleviate that sort of I know it's just, I guess, yeah, I can't sort of just criticize you vaguely, but I think I don't like your use of the word immoral, and it's just because in some sense I don't think structures and laws can be immoral. I think individuals, they can obviously,
Well,
but no, but
let's take that word away then, and say unhealthy for the society as a whole.
yeah, I know, but you see now that is a utilitarian standard. Now there are ways of baking utilitarian measures into a legal framework, and none of them are good because none of them are principle based. Essentially, the only way to safeguard society essentially is in each individual field of law and each individual structure of how the law operates, so it has to be done by detail. It can't be done by an overarching sort of protection, like you can't say people have the right to X, and so I mean, like that just doesn't work. I mean, that never works. You can have a general limitations clause and robust rights, then you've kind of got a workable system that is able to sort of redress and maybe restructure things and suggest ways of improving it, or that either you would have to do one option or the other option, and then you kind of order your parliament to go one or the other way, or to create some combination of the two, or to create another way to alleviate the problem. So I do think...
Well, I mean, the scope of a law is good to have appropriately done. That's a certain thing. But,
appropriate.
well, I mean, it depends on the law.
Okay, sorry, I think another philosophical way of breaking down what you said is that technically I think it is not actually immoral, because it is not the activity itself that is immoral, it's the consequence that you are calling immoral. And I can agree that the consequence is immoral. but in some
So aren't you talking about ethics then?
yeah, I mean yeah. So in some sense, just so I guess what I'm saying is that for me, immorality has to do. Okay, this is a very stupid technical. I don't. I have to think about how this impacts on your general point and how I would continue to treat it. But I think actually what you're complaining about is that it's amoral. Is that the structure as it stands on the books and how, what people are able to do is it's an amoral system.
Well, I mean, when you put the burden of trying to describe exactly how it's wrong, it's a hard thing to describe fairly. I think that there are many awful things about it, clearly. If I were that person and I bought an important medication for people that they need and jacked up the price 1,000% or more and lived off of that, I would be a leech on society. That would not help anybody. And maybe I could do something amazing with the money to make up for it, but given the current action so far, doubtful. Very doubtful.
I'm sorry again, but like I don't know that I'm not sure of this, but I'm pretty sure that certain rights, intellectual rights, also have a public good correlation to it, and that if something is being done to contravene the public good, not that it's not promoting it, but that it's actually damaging the public good, I think there it exists actually in the law that you can sort of essentially revoke someone's intellectual property, that you can sort of essentially what's the word, like collapse the patent essentially. Um,
Well, let me see one thing here. I'm trying to find an article for you that will just show you more specific.
All right. Well, while you do that, I'm just trying to understand Arcade's position. So technically, from what I understand, is because of one man's decision, essentially resulted into many people's suffering. Does it get simpler than that? Is that what you're trying to get at?
Well, maybe unnecessary suffering would be one part to it to add.
Yeah, right. Unnecessary.
And
because you can extrapolate that but that's the thing, it's like, but then when I'm trying to get Zhang's point of view, is it that you should have the freedom to do that, but we should find a way how to fix that problem, right? Is that what you're trying to get at?
well,
I don't I'm very uncomfortable with this idea that immorality must be policed by something that is essentially extraneous to the organization of or the structure of the legal system. It has to sort of, it must be part of the legal system, and it must work. It mustn't be an ad hoc adaptation that is sort of administered by managers. It should operate from the books evenly against everyone, so it has to be a consistent rule that is applied prospectively.
Okay, so would you rather to have, say, incentivization? Am I saying that right? Incentivize, like essentially to have people be incentivized to not like have a reason to do, say, what is it, Screlly? I'm not sure what his name is. Essentially, to not have people like that do what he did, and incentivize him to steer in a different direction, which might seem more ethical. But at the end of the day, you still have the freedom to do so, but it just wouldn't make sense because of these factors.
You see, what's like, from what I know, like basically you can't patent in terms of products that you produce. You can't really patent a design of a project. The only thing that you can patent is the manufacturing process. You can't actually patent the object itself, in some sense. So, like, you can't control exclusively an idea. You can only control the expression of that idea. Sorry, I think I think I misspoke in that, but that's basically what it comes down to. And so the idea is that the market should generally function, and if there is so that essentially if some guy is selling drugs that are way more expensive than they should be, that should attract another firm to essentially find a way to produce the same thing, the same drug, but through a different process that isn't patented, and then compete with them. That would sort of be the ideal. But I mean, obviously, when you're dealing with medicine, it is so inextricably linked with the public good that that medicine should be generally available and broadly available. But that generally that also has to be juxtaposed with the cost of development and research and things like that, which if that is not recouped, then essentially so in either you make the whole thing a public industry where government is using universities essentially to research all drug research, and manufacturers essentially get licenses from the government, and essentially that the government owns that intellectual property or something like that, in some sense, that they develop the ownership of it, and then they basically sell licenses just for making it. I mean, that would actually be the best way to control this, is that you say, well, okay, yes, we've got these fuck-ups that are happening because people can do this because it's an open market. We want to restructure the whole industry. We're going to do it in-house. We are going to be the producers of the intellectual property. We're going to invest it. We're going to fund it. Basically, drug research and development is going to be part of one of the functions of the state, so that we don't have to get into this problem, and that we will just sell licenses to manufacturers. I mean, in some sense, that would be a way to solve this problem, but it would also open a whole slew of other problems of perhaps, corruption and stuff like that, because, when you've got essentially a state-controlled monopoly, that is the center of
communistic medicine right there.
Well, no, it's more in the league with, politicians getting lots of money in back doors, and companies essentially getting political favor and stuff like that. It's the people just have to develop a tendering process that is basically a blind tendering process. Or you could just say that basically every tender will be divided amongst more than one company. So basically you're not allowed to have one company manufacturing one drug. You have to have three, and then you basically compete against you compete them against each other to work out which one is actually going to be able to lower its cost or something like that, and or has the better quality product, and then you sort of choose there, something like that. But
well, I will say that generally the pharmaceutical companies really have a tight grip on the United States, and medications can end up being very expensive. It's rare to find alternatives sometimes, and the process of making a new medication that's legal here is a long time, so you could easily gouge hard for a while with the way things currently are. Even if someone finds a new way to solve the problem, it's going to be hard to get it ready and approved. And with that kind of a price gouging, from $13 to $50 to $750, it's very difficult. You can make a lot of money really fast, and you could really hurt people. But I mean, my point wasn't so much the guy himself, but more the precedents involved and what I was saying before.
I mean, it does seem like it wouldn't be that hard to create. I mean, I can't think of one right now, but it wouldn't be that hard to come up with a mathematical law or something like that, where you could essentially have some kind of price gouging monitor, or something like that. That if basically that you set up a process where if the price of something goes up inconsistently, like that isn't
With
that
inflation.
that isn't directly related to the procedure of the cost of producing it, that it's then investigated to see if it's so that you almost have like a built-in investigation process that then gives a recommendation. Still, it's not the best thing, but yeah, I mean, I guess that is basically like proper regulation, which is like, because as soon as you have the state controlling things like that, it's also sometimes you get worse
The corruption will follow. And soon one company gets in good and every other company has been price gouging. So you gotta stop them.
We don't have a problem like that in my country. Actually, we actually do have some of the other corruption, but in my country, if you go to any pharmacy, the price of the medicine is the same, always. Doesn't matter where you go, the price of the medicine is always the same.
That's very good.
But
I will say, just for Eskii more than anything, but also for me here, that the idea that if you act within the law, it's okay, I think doesn't fly, because you can always act within the law and do something that's immoral. I think there should be the law for purposes that are very big and important and overreaching. And then there should be something else. Maybe it's like what they're doing now with Me Too. Not hopefully that powerful, hopefully much less powerful, but a public opinion thing that has some bearing on your life without ruining your life if people think you've done the wrong thing.
I was trying to make the point that like immorality is an individual. I don't see immorality as being moot. It's not like as if, oh well, it's okay if he's immoral, he didn't break the law. Like, I don't believe that, but I do believe in terms of finding a way to combat immorality, or it needs to be made unlawful somehow, or it needs to be tolerated. I do think that we have to find a way to live with the imperfections, or we need to find a way to translate that complaint into a contention around unlawfulness, and the inability and the inability to practically bridge those two problems is where all the corruption comes in. I think is where a lot of the degradation, because you want a simple solution, or you just want to say, oh well, we just want the moral thing to happen, and moral authority is the one thing that the state is so bad at orchestrating, essentially. It is.
Wow.
I almost think the best thing is, if there's a failure in any way, the best thing you can do is to make sure that you have a free enough, open society in that particular area that people would be free to make an alternative or to generate competition with the thing that is upsetting. That it's not that you destroy the thing that is upsetting, that you are able to not only tolerate it, but that you can have the real hope that it would organically be able to sort of fix itself. I think a lot of things that people complain about are like, there are things that could be like this sort of drug stuff. That's different. I think that seems like a hard problem that needs that needs a solution. But there are a lot of problems that are essentially, they're not structural problems. Like, if the activists involved would actually just sort of do something proactive rather than reactive and expecting somebody else to solve their solution for them, that would be like, we would actually live in a much better society, kind of thing. And then once you actually try to solve the problem, then you realize the scope of the problem, then you end up finding the real causes of the problem, which are often abstract and have to do with the failure of the structure of the law. And you end up really creating the kind of law that is required to create the kind of the organic fluidity of people being able to kind of try out different things, because a lot of the time it's like you could, if you want to be a company that produces this type of thing, you have to jump through these hoops. And so already the kind of company that is already jumping through these hoops is so invested in that particular model of being able to service those costs that essentially they have to operate in that way that they're operating in the market, you know. And so like a lot of the sort of the structural complaints that we have about, you know, bad actors, they are kind of sympathetic. This was the point that I was going to make earlier, is that there's a sympathy that is often essentially like the people that want change, people that want things to get better, that have, you know, these kind of these immoral, these complaints about immorality. There's a certain sympathy with the structural kind of ideological, you know, so it's like, you know, you tell your government, I want things to be moral, so you better make everything moral, and then they come in and they impose these regulations, which are not very good regulation because they're ad hoc. They're like you must jump through this hoop because we can kind of superficially think that if you jump through that hoop, then you're not being immoral. Like this is the immoral obstacle course, you know. And because you've set up a whole lot of things that have to do with guarding morality and not like principled thinking, you know, like first principle premised thinking in terms of like, how do you create an organic system that is able to self-correct without government addendum, you know, like adding more all the time to revise the latest bullshit, you know. So in some sense, if you had some kind of thing, I can think of a few things which aren't the exact solution to this problem, but basically if you said that if you had an automatic thing where if a price went up or just automatically more than one company would produce the same drug or something like that, or like a company would have to license another company for producing the same drug, and then you would have to like, you would force them to give out that license, and the cost of that license would be pegged at something of like the research that went into it or something like that that has to do with the time that it's been in the market or something like that. It would be pegged to a formula, right? So that essentially you could say that it's equitable and that companies will know that when they research and discover new drugs that they will make money in the end. They'll always make money. It's profitable to do it. But essentially you've got like a formulaic built-in thing where you don't have to send a person in to go and change things. That the formula is clever enough that essentially it already has built within it how it would already imagine the kinds of changes that might happen in the future, and that would kind of be built into the formula, so that like the formula wouldn't be too complicated. Like it would be as simple as it could be. It wouldn't try to add too many components, you know. It would try to add up the core components, and it would maybe even describe those components in terms of principles and not in terms of like labels, so that if things change, those principles won't have changed, and so that they could still be fed into the formula.
It's like that saying, let the regulators.
Yeah.
Yeah. You set up the mechanism, and so that the people know that that mechanism is held above their head, and so that they have to act intelligently with the basically you end up creating something that hopefully never gets used, but that it is essentially, by its mere structure, it will orchestrate a kind of organic promotion of efficient things that maximize, you know, most good things, you know. So that's the best way to regulate, is not by the imposition.
What I would suggest for that sort of thing would be you figure out how much money is spent in research and, you know, and manufacturing the drug, and just say once a company has made 10 times that in profits, after that point they can still profit from selling the drug, but it must be a margin of the cost of making the drug of, you know, say up to 20% more than the cost of manufacture for the drug, and that's it. So as we get drugs that are new, they can be rewarded heavily, but over time it will become cheaper and cheaper. Or at one point it will just become much cheaper to buy the drug. It'll be more freely available. That way you couldn't gouge people on very old drugs anymore. But you could still make a reasonable profit in making them.
Yeah, I would tend towards not wanting to have a quantitative formulaic component. Like after this threshold, then suddenly it stops being as profitable. Uh,
Well, I mean, if you've already made 15 times or 10 times or 20 times what you've put into the drug, it's very successful.
well,
This would only really hit the very successful drugs.
well, you see, well, getting 15 time return on a drug, I don't think that that's necessarily a very successful drug. I mean, like if unsuccessful drugs don't make 2 times what their investment was, like it's probably not worth the risk in some sense. It wouldn't have been worth it even if it sells for 2 times its research. It wouldn't be worth it to sort of invest in it. I mean, like, but you know, there are two issues here because it's like one is that you never hear about the drugs that never made it, essentially,
That's true.
and that doesn't necessarily get calculated into the 15 times. I would rather just have it that you can compel a company to sell licenses to manufacturing the drug, but that license would basically have a price tag on it that would be regulated by the formula, and that formula would try to be independent of they would have some level of profitability built into it, but that it wouldn't. It would be sort of pegged at the research, the total research, or something like that, or I don't know.
Well, perhaps so. But it's a difficult topic. I will say one thing too in this area. I should go pretty soon though. I think like right now there are things like that where there are kind of essentially failures of capitalism that the left in America, like Bernie Sanders in particular, he seems like a man of character and conviction, whether or not you like where his character is going. He has it by the mouthful. But that guy, he's pointed out that Walmart, for example, in America, they know that if you don't pay employees enough, they just get free health care. So they're basically subsidized by the government because they don't pay their employees enough that they could get health care, so the government picks up the tab for their employees. And, things like that where companies are just leeching off of the tax dollar are being called out by him. And then there's another thing, not with the Scully case, I believe, but another case where insulin manufacturers are charging so much for insulin in America that people that, they have a job, they're working 40 hours a week, they don't make enough to really afford insulin and whatever else they need in life. So people have been dying because they'll go half doses on their insulin medication and just hope that works. But then it doesn't, and they die.
Yeah, that's crazy. I have no idea how that's even possible because I thought insulin has. I don't actually know, but I would have thought that insulin doesn't have a patent anymore, that anyone can manufacture it. So if I'm right about that, that means that a whole lot of manufacturers conspired essentially to raise the price collectively to sort of set the price up. Because I mean, as far as I think that you don't have to buy a license to produce insulin. I don't think. Well, I don't know, but I would have thought that's no longer under ownership.
If you can see it, here's Bernie Sanders' Twitter on it. I don't know the full story. This is what he's saying. And this is the rhetoric that is being shoveled. He says the inventors of insulin sold his patent for $1. Eli Lilly now charges $360 a month for the drug and made $3.2 billion in profits last year. Meanwhile, Americans must sell all their possessions to get the insulin they need. We're going to take on the greed of the drug industry. And, they say every lie has a grain of truth. I think every, bad intended end campaign has a few good intentions along the way that are that grain of truth for them. And that's what he's going with, and it's very compelling when you consider. Very emotionally charged, very powerful. And I can't disagree that that person is immoral. They sold the patent for $1, and now people that bought it, I guess, are charging $360 a month. And I'm sure I'm misinformed in 5 different ways. You could point out if you did all the but
Well,
holy crap.
I mean, intellectual property is one of the biggest problems that our culture even has. I mean, the amount of, the public. When I say public good, I don't mean the good for the public. I mean the things that belong to the public. Like in terms of our cultural intellectual property. Like in memes and things like that, and people getting copy striked on YouTube and stuff like that, and what is in, what do they call it, fair use and stuff like that. Like we do have I would say that's the weakest element that we have in our society as it currently stands, is intellectual property. It would be nice probably to have a general revolution on that point, but coming up with something that is workable, that sort of works for everything. I mean,
Very hard.
a simple solution would just be to nationalize all or large portions of the emotionally charged research. Like if you made all medical research developed by national governments and national public funding, then and so it would, and that ownership would continue to reside in the state. Essentially, you see, this is the thing, is that in the current society that we live in, we have all these people complaining about things and stuff like that, but no one is actually willing to take accountability for solving these problems.
With that system you're describing, though, no one could do research without approval by the government to do it, basically?
No, you wouldn't do it that way. You would do it another way. I mean, basically, still no one would do it, but you would basically say, medical intellectual property belongs to the state. So if you develop it privately, it doesn't belong to you. It still belongs to the state. So essentially...
Then why would they develop new drugs?
Well, they wouldn't. The government would have to do it.
Well, you see the problem there, right?
Well,
You stifled medical progress.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, it depends how well the government does it. Depends how much responsibility they take for doing it. That's the point I was trying to make about responsibility. Is that this is the thing? Is that if you either you get gouged by the price, essentially because you put it in the hands of private commerce, or you find a way to take responsibility for it, and then it's in your hands, and then you have to deliver it rather than the market. So this is the thing, is that people are averse to responsibility and accountability, but they just want nice things, and those are basically, and they want to call people immoral when they don't get those nice things. And so this is the fundamental sort of conflict. It's somewhat insoluble unless you have the balls to sort of take the responsibility forthrightly for. But I would also say that one of the solutions as well is that it wouldn't necessarily stop all private research. You could get essentially charitable private research. You could get, if people care about a particular illness, they could say, well, let me get funds together and fund a private research lab. And yes, we're not going to end up owning the intellectual property, but in some sense, it might be better because, there's probably a lot of medical knowledge that is not shared with the public, because if they really did find a cheap solution to all illness, do you really think they would share it?
Well, that's true. They probably wouldn't. It's probably just eat broccoli every day. But I don't know. I'll say that the tricky part here is that America, well, the USA rather, seems to be the loot pinata that fuels the medical industries of the world in a lot of ways. Like, the amount that is paid in America for medicine is ridiculous. And other countries get things much cheaper because of the research done, because they charge so much in America for the things. It's really ridiculous.
Yeah, I think my country might profit in that way because, for instance, I think we get generic insulin, which is made in India, and because we're like a third world country, we don't have to pay the patent or something like that. Or maybe actually the company has sold the patent to foreign companies to sell in foreign markets.
Or it might just be that they realize they can't charge that much in foreign countries, and so they charge a much more reasonable amount. And then they'd say, hey, we can gouge in America, so they gouge in America.
Yeah, it could be that.
And I mean, I don't want to be overly patriotic here. As you mentioned, open heart surgery would not be possible without your country. There's a lot of medical benefits out there in the world, but I think that's it. I would say it's easy to want a system that neglects the amount of money or capital it takes to get the innovations when they're given through the money of others, as often as they may be in this exact area.
Yeah, no, I do think that a lot of medical innovation is driven firstly by American, by because you can't attract the brains unless you pay the money, and you get the money unless you charge, and so America is essentially funding. I mean, that's also, they say that about the medical stuff, the medical advancements in European medicine essentially is all stolen essentially or copied from the functioning market that America maintains. So socialized medicine doesn't work unless you have a free market medical, kind of engine of innovation to sort of to take things from. But I will say as well that although there's a different kind of innovation that the market offers, there is a stark contrast. Like basically, America is very good at innovating the actual procedure end of it. Like actually, oh, come in here, let me give you LASIK eye surgery, and you can walk out, and a day later you've got perfect eyesight, and it only took 20 minutes to do the LASIK eye surgery. That kind of innovation, is what America is good at investing in, the delivery of it. But the actual concept of it, the actual research of that, although sometimes it is refined in private labs, it actually comes more from universities, because R&D departments, research and development, these are people that they need a free flow of information. They need to share ideas. They need to bounce ideas off of things, and that happens usually around universities. Like MIT is a huge example of this. Like there were so many research and development companies that set up their workshops right next to MIT because they needed essentially to field the research coming from the university to then specialize into creating particular developments for the industry. And essentially a lot of the stuff that was basically being funded from public funds, because the MIT is funded from the American government and the American taxpayer, essentially all of that good into academic work, which academics can actually talk to one another about ideas openly, whereas the research and development teams are very insulated. They don't want to share their secrets with each other. And so it's like it's this real thing, is that there are impediments to research. I mean, this is why they have so much ethical problems in medicine, because essentially you have to recreate the same study. So if you are testing medicine on someone and you keep that a secret, then somebody else might test the same medicine on somebody else, and it's like you didn't necessarily have to do that if you just shared that information. So technically that is immoral, that you have to put more people through human experimentation for the greater good, when it was actually unnecessary for the greater good, just because people are retaining information which would be much greater public good if it was shared. But technically it is a private asset. It is a commodity as well, in some sense. And I just wanted to point out that the idea of having publicly funded research is not, you have to realize, like, publicly funded research gave us nuclear power. It also gave us nuclear bombs. It also gave us, like...
Velcro.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Oh, Velcro, you said.
Gave us Velcro as well.
Anyway, I probably am talked out now. I'm sorry, I pontificate so much.
Well, I see what your point is there. I think a lot of it really is from more or less university that goes into a private field in some way. I agree with that. I think a lot of research ends up being done in a scholarly level if you're lucky, and then being kind of scooped up in some way, and then the corporations find a way to apply it that gives them money. I will say though that I don't think the drug companies out there have been doing the best lately. Like I haven't seen, and maybe it's just because you see all the bad stuff, but I haven't seen all these amazing innovations. They haven't been lifted up on a pedestal for me to look at. And I see stuff more like this. I don't know if they let you do this where you're from, but this is an American drug commercial for a drug on television. They do this all the time.
Can I look at it afterwards, or should I look at it now?
Oh, well, either way is fine. But it's these commercials, and I didn't read this one myself. I didn't look at it myself all the way through, but I'm assuming that I'm right just by luck of the draw and the way these go. It's going to be like this nice, happy, flowery, friendly thing about how Chantix helps you in some way. And then, like, half of the commercial will be a guy in a really fast, quiet voice telling you all the flaws of Chantix. Like, if you don't do this or this, it'll give you heart disease. It's going to kill you. It's going to kill you 5 different ways till Sunday. You're going to have radiation poisoning. And just all these different flaws. And it's like, the whole point of it is to get you to tell your doctor, I need Chantix. So then your doctor will prescribe you Chantix. And they go to the doctors, and they basically pay them off to prescribe their drugs too. So then a doctor has a bias and a motivation to prescribe a drug that might not be the best drug for you because he wants to, I guess, fill that magical quota. Who knows if there's a real quota or not, but he's definitely motivated towards that drug. It's very immoral, I think.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem with drugs is just that they don't work so well. I mean, at least a lot of the mood ones, you know, like it's like it's a form of mind control in some sense, you know, like I think people naturally just have a kind of an understanding about, you know, how sort of, you know, these things are exogenous to the body and they're not, you know, you know, in 50 years' time, we'll probably look back and say, why did we poison ourselves with, you know, that kind of insanity? But anyway.
Yeah, I think that's likely the case, and I think these are more money grabs than innovation, and I would say they generally seem to hurt people. I've seen people that are on like 5 medications at once sometimes. And it's like they're running that treadmill of life just to pay for the medication.
I think, I mean, there's a whole lot of psychiatry that could be displaced by, I mean, I've been told on good authority that instead of taking a Prozac pill, you could have a handful of cashews and it would be just as effective. Like, basically, the whole point of Prozac is that it somehow promotes the same neurochemical response that you would get from eating cashews. You know, so it's like, so they just essentially worked out a way to make a handful of cashews that give you no other nutritional benefit and that also produce the same effects through an unnatural process that is exogenous to our evolutionary, you know,
yeah.
experience, you know, like it's so I mean I do think like a lot of it could be displaced by an honest, well, the problem is that the state of psychology, this is a completely different topic, and we both know the state of psychology in academia or in the medical field or in the scientific field is just, you know, is part of the cancer of the general philosophical corruption in science. But anyway, that's a completely another topic. But anyway, okay, you said you had to go. Was that an hour ago that you said you had to go? So let me set you free at last.
All right. Well, it was good talking with you. I hope you do watch that commercial. It's only 1 minute and 30 seconds, but it really, it will paint a picture for you that you may not have gotten.
This will certainly be interesting. I wonder if I should worry about about having you, because you said the name of the drug. I wonder if we're going to get sued. But let's live dangerously. Okay, I'm going to upload this to YouTube, I think.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you so much, Arcade. I'll see you.
See you around. Have a good night.
You too. Cheers.
Cheers.